In the records of the Imperium's history, few chapters embody a harsh duality of loyalty and brutality as vividly as the Iron Hands. Born as the 10th Legion during the Emperor's monumental undertaking known as the Great Crusade, they were forged in order to bring light to the lost corners of the galaxy. Their origins and evolution reveal a relentless march towards a more mechanical perfection, if you will, through the rejection of all perceived weakness, epitomized by their open disdain for the frailty and weakness of the flesh. The saga of the Iron Hands begins on Terra during the closing days of the Unification Wars. Initially known as the Stormwalkers, the Legion drew heavily from the warlike cults of Old Albia, a region known for producing warriors of unparalleled physical resilience. These early recruits would be shaped into the Emperor's tools of conquest, tasked with reclaiming humanity's scattered remnants across the stars. The 10th Legion first entered the records of the Imperium's many wars, in particular with the crushing of the mutant Scythers, before obliterating the Xenos Lyrics on Obereth. Although victorious in both engagements, with surprisingly few losses, these campaigns showed no distinctive hallmarks for any styles of warfare. It was not until their deployment on the orc-held world of Rust that the methodology in which they would fight wars would be fully displayed. Here, they used massed firepower in slow grinding advances, which revealed a kernel of the legacy which the Legion would develop into its own tactical identity. However, everything would change once they would become reunited with their Primarch Ferrus Manus, a warrior of unyielding resolve and a genius at the forge, comparable to both Fulgrim and Vulcan. Ferrus would instill an indomitable will into his Legion, reshaping them to fit his image, to the point that his very name became the Legion's moniker, and his philosophy of ruthless efficiency became their creed. Ferrus Manus, while a master, smith, and leader, viewed weakness as anathema to all things. This ethos would become the Iron Hands' twisted doctrine. The Primarch's contempt for the weaknesses and frailty of humanity catalyzed the Legion's embrace of bionics. That, along with their strong alignment with the Adeptus Mechanicus, led to the Iron Hands viewing their body as a prison, vulnerable and impure. And with each implant, each augmentation, they felt one step closer to the purity that they sought. During the Great Crusade, the Iron Hands would become a hammer for the Emperor of unparalleled precision and brutality, annihilating countless foes to further the Emperor's grand design for humanity. Yet, this unwavering determination came with a price, a pride and brutality which at points surpassed both the Iron Warriors and the Emperor's children. Said pride and brutality would eventually earn them a reputation for cold-heartedness, even amongst their brethren legions. The legion's history, however, would take a rather tragic turn during the Horus Heresy proper, when Ferrus Manus, in his zealous pursuit for the Emperor's vision, would be martyred at the hands of his closest brother and friend Fulgrim of the Emperor's children. This loss shattered the Iron Hands, both militarily and spiritually, instilling a deep-seated hatred for any and all perceived weaknesses, not just in their enemies, but in themselves and their allies. Following the Horus Heresy, the Codex Astartes decreed the division of the vast legions into small, manageable chapters. The Iron Hands endured as one of these original first founding chapters, perpetuating their Primarch's legacy and identity. Despite their unwavering faith in the Emperor, they remain unique amongst the Adeptus Astartes for their extreme reverence for machinery and their rather entwined relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus. This symbiosis is more than a pragmatic belief. It is doctrinal at this point. The Iron Hands see augmentation as not merely practical improvements, but as a manner and a methodology for spiritual ascension. To them, every replaced limb and every defeated foe brings them closer to the purity that might one day allow them to stand beside their lost Primarch. To understand the Iron Hands is to understand the paradox that they have become, a chapter that clings to humanity's noblest of ideals, of unity and progress while simultaneously rejecting the flesh that binds them to their origins. Their history is a tale of triumph, tragedy, and an unyielding desire to purge all weakness, whether in themselves or via purging the enemies of mankind. In their relentless pursuit of perfection, the Iron Hands are poised to become a testament to the Emperor's grand design, an unyielding and unbroken and an unrepentant machine geared towards the survival and glory of humanity. When the galaxy was torn asunder by the Horus Heresy, the Iron Hands would find themselves far from Terra, unable to intervene as the Imperium was plunged into civil war. Their Primarch Ferrus Manus, so consumed by his rage and fury, not only at the betrayal of those legions who had fallen to chaos, but by the particular treachery of his closest brother, Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's children. This rage was compounded by his inability to strike directly at the traitors. With a fury born of bitter determination, Ferrus Manus mustered his most hardened Astartes and set course for the Isstvan system, where destiny awaited him. The Isstvan V campaign, or as it would later become known as, the Dropsite Massacre, was a pivotal point in the history of the Iron Hands. This catastrophic betrayal would define their chapter for millennia to come. Alongside the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, the Iron Hands formed a veritable venerable vanguard of loyalist forces tasked with confronting the traitors led by War Master Horus. However, what awaited them was no ordinary battle, but a meticulously and expertly orchestrated ambush. In the chaos of the Dropsite Massacre, the Loyalist legions found themselves unable to hold their own as, regardless of their unparalleled valor, they were completely overwhelmed and outgunned. Yet their bravery failed to shield them from treachery. Ferrus Manus would then seek to confront Fulgrim directly, the brother who had betrayed both his father and their bond. This confrontation ended in utter and complete tragedy, with Fulgrim wielding a legendary demon blade, tainted by the vile, voracious influences of Slaanesh, which allowed him to strike down Ferrus Manus, severing his head with a single, devastating, elegant blow. This loss would go on to shatter the Iron Hands, as they would be undone by their own Primarch's hubris, leading to a shattering of the belief that they held so true, that strength alone could triumph over all, even treachery. And with the wicked blade swing of Fulgrim was this vision, this ethos, and the identity of the Iron Hands shattered. The massacre that would also decimate their ranks left the Iron Hands as one of these so-called shattered legions. Despite the traitor's declaration of Ferrus Manus' death, the Iron Hands refused to believe it and accept the grim reality. While the Primarch's body was recovered, his head would never be. Yet, the Iron Hands would attempt to create a pantomime of their Primarch by desecrating his body and attempting to make a mechanical puppet in order to stand in. This puppet would at one point incense and enrage Vulcan, so much so that he would reprimand the entire legion and destroy the remains of his brother in order to prevent such a disgusting act of desecration to occur again. For over 10,000 standard years, the chapter has nurtured an unyielding hatred, channeling it into an inexhaustible engine of vengeance. The Iron Hands' belief that the flesh is weak is deeply entwined with their experiences during the Horus Heresy. To them, flesh is a symbol of vulnerability, a subject to decay, corruption, and betrayal. Their conviction in the superiority of the machine over flesh is not merely a philosophical one, it is a doctrine rooted in their survival and the enduring, ever-ongoing quest for strength. This creed has also been shaped by the stoic resilience of the people of Medusa, their desolate homeworld. Medusa's harsh environment has led to a rather hardy group of inhabitants who have instilled the Iron Hands and their culture with a steadfastness that would carry them throughout the trials and tribulation of their now shattered legacy. Following the death of Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands would withdraw to Medusa, where their hatred smoldered like embers in a forge, as they would become increasingly insular and suspicious of others, isolating themselves not only from the Imperium at large, but even from their fellow Astartes. After the second founding, this isolation deepened further still, transforming them into bitter recluses, their ire no longer solely reserved for the traitors. Loyalists, they believe, bore equal guilt for failing to prevent the Horus Heresy, and for allowing the Emperor to fall. This self-imposed exile and all-encompassing rage became a shield against the perceived weakness and madness that encompassed the galaxy. For the Iron Hands, no one was truly their ally. Not the Imperium, and not even themselves. No one was free from the stain of failure. The Iron Hands would endure as a chapter defined by loss and an uncompromising, unending, largely unsuccessful pursuit for greater strength. Their fury was not seen as a reckless flame, but a carefully stoked fire, driving them in a singular direction, forward into battle. And in their ceaseless conquests, they would purge weakness wherever they found it. The memory of Ferrus Manus would become both a source of pain and inspiration. Within the cold void of the galaxy, the Iron Hands would stand apart, as an unstoppable and unforgiving force of nature, as they would bear the scars of betrayal and loss openly, with each mechanical limb and implant, their legacy in essence shaped by the tragedies of the past, and their hopes for the future anchored in the belief that their Primarch may somehow return. Until that day comes, they will continue to march relentlessly, their hatred a beacon in the darkness, and their resolve a testament to the Emperor's grand design. The Iron Hands chapter of the 41st Millennium has now been fractured into clan companies, yet they are united in the purpose of acting as a chapter, all of them carrying the same profound grudge, one that burns as fiercely as their hatred for flesh. However, they reserve a special loathing for the successor chapters of their fellow Shattered Legions, in particular for those of the Salamanders and the Raven Guard. This is because they believe that had these two legions fought alongside the Iron Hands in full force during the calamitous dropsite massacre instead of retreating, the Iron Hands believe they would have somehow won the day. They contend that, contrary to reason and history, that had the Salamanders and Raven Guard fought on, their Primarch Ferrus Manus might not have fallen in battle. This bitterness extends far beyond their animosity towards others, as the Iron Hands see frailty not just in retreat or surrender, but within the very essence of organic life itself. To them, the flesh is weak, a fragile, corruptible, and transitory fact of life. This belief underpins every aspect of their culture and war doctrine. For the Iron Hands, the ultimate answer to humanity's impermanence lies in the cold perfection of machinery. From the moment an aspirant is initiated into the chapter, the transformation begins. A ritual rooted in the legend of their Primarch leads neophytes to undergo a removal of their left hand, which will eventually be replaced by a bionic one. This practice recalls and mirrors the tale of Ferrus Manus, whose hands were encased in living metal after his fabled battle with the monstrous metallic serpent of Medusa. The ritual varies, with some initiates severing their own hand, while others endure the excruciating pain of plunging their hand into molten rivers of lava on Medusa, transforming their agony into iron within. This rejection of the flesh grows with each passing standard year. An Iron Hand battle brother comes to despise their biological body regardless of what it provides them, as if it were a wretched burden, and replacing it piece by piece with superior bionics seems to be the only solution. By the time he has served several centuries, a warrior may almost be entirely mechanical, with only the barest organic components essential for their survival being left, the brain and some scattered vital organs being all that's left of their original human form. This relentless pursuit of perfection often leads to dismemberment, and for the most venerable warriors, integration into the iron bodies of dreadnoughts is not seen as a macabre necessity of combat, but rather a blessing. These ancient lumbering machines are not just war engines to the chapter, they are the leaders of the Iron Hands, collectively forming the Iron Council. These dreadnoughts embody the chapter's rejection of weakness and its unyielding resolve. The Iron Hands have no singular chapter master. Instead, their governance is decentralized, as each clan company operates independently, roaming the barren landscapes of Medusa in mobile fortress monasteries. These clan companies protect the planet's scattered nomadic tribes, from which they recruit further battle brothers, where only the strongest and most resilient individuals will be deemed worthy. The Iron Hand's near total rejection of the flesh has sparked accusations of heresy amongst many. Some even whisper that this obsession may draw from a deeply seated gene flaw, which would perhaps explain the scarcity of successor chapters sired by the Iron Hands. Their detractors argue that replacing the organs gifted by the Emperor and Ferrus Manus with bionics is an affront to the sacred inheritance of the Astartes. Yet none can deny the efficiency of the Iron Hands in battle. The Iron Hands and their hatred for the weakness of the flesh and all things fuels their grim resolve. These are traits that have broken countless enemies of the Imperium. For all their bitterness and isolation, the Iron Hands remain steadfastly loyal to the Emperor and his vision, their wrath becoming an unyielding, red-hot iron upon which the enemies of mankind shall fall. The Iron Hands' journey is one of unrelenting, unending transformation. From their early days they sought to transcend the limitations of the flesh, forging themselves into instruments of war, as unbreakable as their namesake. Despite their scars, both physical and spiritual, they stand unyielding, driven by an enduring belief that through hatred and purging of weakness, they may honor the legacy of Ferrus Manus, who they believe will one day return to lead them. In the cold void of the 41st millennium, the Iron Hands march on, their footsteps echoing with the weight of their mechanical forms and the unyielding fury that has defined their existence for over 10 millennia. As the machine does not falter, neither shall they. From the onset of their formative years to the records of the Great Crusade, the Iron Hands have stood as a testament to deliberate precision and calculated genius, in particular that granted to them via their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, who was known for his methodical nature and his unyielding belief in logic. Ferrus Manus would go on to forge his legion into a military force like no other, regimented to perfection. While many Space Marine legions relied on rigid hierarchies or universally applied structures, the Iron Hands embraced what might be described as organized compartmentalization. This strategic design was not simply a reflection of Ferrus Manus' engineering mind, but a profound adaptation of the harsh realities of war. Unlike the Emperor's children, whose finely layered hierarchy epitomized centralized order, or the Ultramarines who adhered to rationalized and codified doctrines, the Iron Hands operated as a collection of concentric, interdependent components. At the core of this structure were their orders, autonomous formations that combined companies, support elements, and logistical assets into a single unified whole. Each order functioned as an independent war machine capable of executing complex operations without outside support. Within an order, every unit would have a defined purpose, whether it was legionary squads, armored squadrons, auxiliary support, and only together would these components form a seamless network of interlocking functions, each piece vital to the order's overall efficiency, yet each piece able to fit more than one role at a time. This design mirrored the mechanical systems Ferrus Manus so admired, a collection of parts working in perfect harmony, where the failure of one was not merely an inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe that could be averted. Orders would then be assigned tasks with singular focus, and success would be expected rather than an aspiration. Pride and honor would demand it, and failure was a concept foreign to the Iron Hands Legion and their ethos. This fierce interdependence sometimes would lead to rivalries, as orders coming from different clans would compete for glory, their pride driving them to greater and greater feats of valor and efficiency. At the heart of the Legion's identity were the clans, formations distinct from standard chapter organization or any other legion. While similar in scale, the clans were deeply rooted in the feudal cultures of Medusa, the Iron Hands' very homeworld. Medusa's nomadic tribes served as both a recruiting ground and a cultural foundation for the clans, allowing the environment to shape their characteristics of drive and self-sufficiency. Each clan functioned as a so-called pocket legion, fully capable of independent operations as they maintained their own logistics, armories, and void ships, their autonomy extending to governance as well. At the helm of each clan stood a chieftain, or an Iron Lord, whose authority was derived directly from Ferrus Manus. These leaders ruled their clans with an iron fist, enforcing discipline and ensuring that their warriors met the excruciating standards set by their Primarch. Yet the clans were more than just administrative units. They were competitive entities, each with its own identity and traditions. They would vie not only for battlefield glory, but for the limited resources every legion had, and for the favor of Ferrus Manus. These rivalries, while fierce, were tempered by a shared belief in their Primarch's vision, to the point that each clan viewed itself as a vital cog in the machine of the Legion, its success essential to the strength of the whole. The duality of cooperation and competition would for a long time define the Iron Hands' organizational philosophy. Orders, though autonomous, often drew resources from multiple clans, creating an environment where rivalries could either fracture any form of unity or push the Legion itself to greater heights. Ferrus Manus encouraged this dynamic, believing that it honed the edge of his warriors and kept them from complacency. This system of compartmentalized autonomy and competitive independence made the Iron Hands uniquely adaptable, as they could deploy with precision and effectiveness at a higher efficiency than almost any other legion. Their orders and clans functioning as independent battle groups or uniting seamlessly into larger-scale campaigns. It also reflected the stoic and self-reliant culture of Medusa, leading to a greater integration between aspirants and the Space Marines themselves. The structure of the Iron Hands Legion as a whole was as much a reflection of Ferrus Manus' character as it was a product of his strategic vision. Where other armies saw his machines and assemblies of moving parts that, when properly calibrated, could achieve feats of unparalleled precision and power, he viewed it as a philosophy that was entrenched into every facet of his legion, from its orders to its clans to even its warriors, and the aspirants, neophytes, and humans who resided on Medusa. Though their methods might seem cold and unyielding, the Iron Hands' approach was forged in a crucible of necessity, as they sought perfection not for themselves, but to be better able to serve the Emperor and fulfill his dream of a united humanity. In their compartmentalized structure and relentless pursuit of efficiency, the Iron Hands embodied the iron resolve within their own Primarch. And this is a legacy that has endured even as the galaxy has torn itself asunder time and time again. Under the meticulous guidance of Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands Legion would be crafted into an unstoppable force. Whether operating as a single company or with the full might of their legion amassed, their approach was methodical and crushing. The Legion itself pursued its objectives with a single-minded intensity, which often had them becoming immovable or unstoppable juggernauts. This unwavering focus could lead to extraordinary successes, but it also rendered the Legion slow to adapt or adopt new practices and change direction when the circumstances became those that demanded quick and excruciating flexibility. However, this was no accident. Ferrus Manus deliberately designed the Legion to concentrate authority and initiative into the hands of a few key leaders by creating distinct tiers of organizational structure. Doing this would lead him to ensure that responsibility and by extension accountability could easily be identified. This system allowed for the swift and decisive action along with the ruthless correction of anything when necessary at a moment's notice. Upon his command within the Iron Hands was a heavy burden, and those who bore it wielded the power over life and death. Each shield centurion, the commander of a company, possessed the authority to reward or punish their subordinates without recourse. This included the ultimate punishment of summary execution, should a legionary fail to meet expectations. Higher up the chain of command, Iron Captains held the same power over their subordinates, including officers, as did Iron Lords over their entire clans. The pinnacle of this hierarchy was Ferrus Manus himself, the undisputed master of the Legion. His word was absolute and unchallenged. Such a structure ensured unity and discipline, but also bared a culture of fear and relentless self-perfection, where failure was not allowed to be an option, or even a consideration. The Iron Hands maintained relatively consistent numbers of warriors throughout the later stages of the Great Crusade. This was a remarkable feat given their unforgiving recruitment practices, though in large part this was because of how few casualties they actually had. Potential recruits from Medusa were subjected to the trials, which many deemed exceptionally brutal, and only the strongest could survive and join the Legion. Even those who passed and faced the challenges in a manner that allowed them to join would continuously face new evaluations, their worth constantly judged against the Legion's ever-exacting standards. Those who failed, whether they be aspirants or even captured prisoners, often met a rather grim fate. Many would be transformed into servitors, their bodies and minds repurposed to serve the Legion's needs. To this day, it is whispered that such servitors formed the extensive labor force of Medusa's current existence, ensuring the chapters and at one time the Legion's war machine remained at peak conditions. If the warriors of the Iron Hands were unforgiving, their arsenal was no less fearsome. Thanks to the strongest ties between any legion and the Mechanicum being at the center of the Legion's own creation. That, along with the technological prowess that they inherited from Ferrus Manus, led the Legion to possess a vast and sophisticated array of war engines. Their arsenal included an unparalleled number of tanks, dreadnought walkers, advanced weaponry, and artillery which were only rivaled by Petarobo's Iron Warriors. Amongst their armories were rare and powerful technologies, including special variants of grav weapons, conversion beamers, laser destroyers, amongst others. These weapons were rarely seen outside of the Mechanicum, and some of the rarer tools that the Iron Hands had could not be found anywhere else other than in the deepest vaults of the First Legion. This was in large part due to the Iron Hands having a rather unique aptitude for mastering and maintaining arcane machinery. Furthermore, the Legions made extensive use of super heavy tanks, such as the Fellblade, and were some of the earliest adopters, along with implementing the use of battle automata. Strategically, the Iron Hands preferred to operate alongside the Mechanicum rather than the Imperial army. To them, human soldiers were an army of fragile and unfit beings, not suited for the rigors of the front line. The cold logic of the Iron Hands dictated that they only serve alongside the strongest and most precise tools employed in the Emperor's War. The Iron Hands Legion stands as a testament to the Ferrus Manus' vision of a perfected war machine, disciplined, unyielding, and devoid of weakness. Their rigid hierarchy and advanced arsenal formed them into an unquestionable force during the Great Crusade. Yet the inflexibility and merciless methods foreshadowed the challenges that they would face in the turbulent times to come. In the end, the Iron Hands embodied a duality of strength and fragility, and their unyielding pursuit of perfection was both their greatest asset and their most glaring flaw, and one that would be a reminder to many that even the strongest machine can falter if it cannot adapt to new inputs. It is important to note how important Ferrus Manus and his legion were in the advancement of the technological capabilities of the Imperium during the Great Crusade. Amongst their advancements and achievements were the development of the prototype for the Indomitus pattern tactical dreadnought armor, the foundational design for what would become the standard Terminator armor across the legions. Another hallmark of their intervention and inventions was the Stormbreaker pattern Thunderhammer, a weapon of immense destructive potential that would become a staple in the arsenals of Space Marine forces. Yet while there were many creations that they shared with the Imperium at large, the Iron Hands did not reveal all their secrets, deciding to keep a few close to the vest. Certain metallurgical techniques, along with weapon systems and cybernetic advancements, would remain closely guarded, ensuring that only the most loyal members of the Legion and the Mechanicum, who were their allies, would know this secretive knowledge. The Iron Hands' organizational structure is one deeply rooted in pseudo-feudal traditions, in particular those from their homeworld, designed to foster a culture of strength where weakness was punished without hesitation. Their ranks operated under a meritocratic system that rewarded capability and achievement over everything else. Those who failed to meet the Legion's exacting expectations would be quickly cast aside, often quite literally. This culture of discipline was further reinforced by Medusan pragmatism, a value system that aligned seamlessly with the cold, ruthless efficiency of the Legion. The volatile temperament that many of the Iron Hands shared with their Primarch would be tempered by the strict adherence to these cultural norms, channeled into productive aggression rather than uncontrolled fury. However, this rigid structure was not without its challenges, as competitions between clans was often fierce and driven by desire to earn favor, be it of their Primarch or of the God Emperor, and to gain additional recruits and resources. This rivalry was not merely ceremonial, as it had tangible effects on the distribution of the Legion's strength. Ferrus Manus, in his calculating logic, allocated resources to those clans that demonstrated the greatest capability, ensuring that success was indeed rewarded, while failure served as a dark and stark reminder and warning to others. At its core, the Iron Hands embodied the brutal philosophy of survival of the fittest and self-improvement. To thrive within the Legion was to adapt, grow, and overcome. Those who faltered and faced adversity would be met with marginalization or complete annihilation. This harsh creed permeated every aspect of the Iron Hands culture and operations, driving their relentless eternal pursuit of perfection further and further still. Yet the same philosophy, so ingrained in their identity, may have sown the seeds for their eventual crisis. The traumatic events of the dropsite massacre on Isstvan V shattered not only the Legion of the Iron Hands, but the psychological toll itself was rather profound. Ferrus Manus' death, coupled with their inability to properly adapt to this catastrophic loss, left the Legion adrift, struggling to reconcile their rigid beliefs with the brutal realities of their utter and complete failure. The Iron Hands were left with a legacy of uncompromising relentlessness and innovation. Their technological contributions and discipline set them apart, even as the Horus Heresy came to an end. Yet their internal rivalries and inflexible creed underscored the limitations of their philosophy, leaving them vulnerable to unforeseen calamities. In the end, the Iron Hands epitomized the brutal duality of their namesake, forged in the fires of Medusa and hardened into an unbreakable machine. Yet, as they were so unbreakable, they were unable to bend and adapt, as the tides of fate demanded it. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium of Man stood battered and betrayed, yet resolute, its survival contingent on reshaping the structures that had sustained it. Central to this effort was the Second Founding, a process that splintered the once vast Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable, autonomous chapters. For the Iron Hands, whose forces were decimated during the betrayal of Isstvan V, this reorganization marked both a new beginning and the start of their long descent into isolation. The Iron Hands would be divided into 4 distinct chapters during the Second Founding. Amongst these were the Red Talons, the Brazen Claws, a third, yet unknown chapter, their identity remaining obscured in the shadows of Imperial record-keeping, while the fourth would retain the name and heraldry of the 10th Legion and be stationed on Medusa. These Astartes committed themselves to preserving the legacy of their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, as their successors were not just physically separated from them, but also gradually fractured, but their shared purpose was gradually fractured along with their identity. Yet this remaining chapter diverged significantly from the ideals and organizational doctrina expounded by the Codex Astartes, charting a path both uniquely shaped by the unforgiving culture of Medusa and the death of their Primarch. As time has gone by, the Iron Hands have increasingly modeled its structure and traditions on the nomadic clans of Medusa, whose brutal pragmatism and obsession with strength mirrored the values instilled by their Primarch. These clans served as a primary recruiting pool for the chapter, reinforcing its unique cultural identity and fostering a stark divergence from other Codex-compliant Astartes forces. This transformation also reflected a deeper, more psychological shift within the chapter, as the catastrophic defeat at Isstvan V had left an indelible, never-healing wound on the Iron Hands, breeding an insulary nature that would become the defining characteristic of the chapter. Contact with successor chapters of the 10th Legion would continuously dwindle over time, as interactions with other first founding legions would as well. As the centuries unfolded, successor chapters themselves became increasingly reclusive in regards to their first founding legion. This was particularly true when looking at the Iron Hands, in large part due to their original focus on strength and self-resilience, as the Iron Hands proper began to obsess with self-resilience and self-reliance. The bonds that had been forged during the Great Crusade and the early days of the Imperium had, in all meanings of the word, began to fray, with the Iron Hands turning inward to nurse their wounds and fortify their resolve. The legacy of the 10th, a once singular unified force under Ferrus Manus, now stands divided, its sons scattered across the galaxy, each pursuing their own path in the shadows of their shared past. This profound isolation was born from both loss and necessity, and would come to be the most well-known feature of the Iron Hands, aside from their bionic enhancements. The recorded history of the 10th Legion, who would become known as the Iron Hands, stands as one of the most intact and well-preserved accounts from the original Space Marine legions. This preservation contrasts sharply with the fragmenting records of others, in particular that of the Blood Angels, which offers us a window into their genesis and the earliest days of their martial traditions, forged in the later waning days of the Unification Wars on Terra. Their formations aligned closely with the Emperor's original vision of the Legions Astartes, as purpose-built instruments of conquests for the coming Great Crusade. The 10th Legion's initial recruitment base was notably diverse, pulling aspirants from across Old Earth. These recruits hailed from disparate regions, including the towering Quintative Plate cities and the defeated territories of Sol's Stellax, each carrying unique cultural imprints that would become part of the greater whole of the 10th Legion. However, one recruitment source stands out as shaping the Legion's early identity the most: Old Albia, known for its deeply entrenched warrior culture and brutal martial traditions, as Albia contributed a substantial number of recruits, instilling in the 10th a fierce pride in its lineage of martial excellence, an influence that would be shared with the 14th Legion, cementing the 10th's reputation for an unyielding ferocity and style of combat that was deeply ingrained in the warrior ethos that predated even the first founding. The 10th's earliest campaigns and their first engagements were as components of larger task forces during the waning battles of the Unification Wars. However, their independent battles and battle honors began to accrue in the wider Sol System conflicts, showcasing their potential as a formidable force. In particular, two campaigns stand out. These would be the Scythers of the Massacre aggression, where they would operate in the confines of a sprawling mutant-infested space hulk, necessitating the 10th to show their disciplined ferocity, and their victory despite overwhelming odds led to many to see the unusually low casualties of the 10th as something to aspire to themselves. The other incident would be the Lyax enclave beneath Obrith's ice. In this operation, the 10th eradicated an alien enclave beneath the frozen caverns of a lifeless world. The harsh conditions of an airless, ice-entombed battlefield, which proved to be no barrier to their methodical advance. Again, they succeeded in delivering victory while maintaining a remarkably high operational efficiency and unbelievably low casualties. While these early campaigns highlighted the 10th Legion's adaptability and tenacity, they did not fully define their distinctive approach to war. These victories were won in confined, inhospitable environments that required precision and discipline, qualities that the Legion had already demonstrated in abundance prior to this. Still, the defining elements of their martial character, in particular the relentless, overwhelming assaults and the fusion of iron discipline with methodical innovation, had yet to emerge fully. Yet, in the formative years, the seeds of what would become the Iron Hands' unyielding ethos would be sown. Their ability to overcome environmental hazards and crush relentless foes with minimal losses hinted at a cold efficiency that would later make them known as one of the Imperium's most feared and reliable forces. These early triumphs, however, would serve as a prelude to the greater deeds and the darker days that awaited the 10th, as the galaxy descended into the fires of the Great Crusade and beyond. As it just so happens, the 10th Legion's true martial identity was forged not within the cold halls of Terra or amidst the confined battles of their early campaigns, but on the arid, unforgiving wastelands of planet O2-34, or more commonly known to history as Rust. It was here, during their third major engagement of the Great Crusade, that the Legion's defining military traits were unveiled, demonstrating a mastery of cold and methodical annihilation upon the enemies of mankind. Rust was a desolate world of oxide-stained deserts, pyrochemical deposits, and eroded husks of ancient forgotten cities. These ruins were not just uninhabited. Instead, they would become the domains of the renowned Recruited Claw Empire of Wardog Kul. This orc dominion spanned across more than 60 star systems to the galactic northeast of Surfenia, with Rust serving as a critical slave mining colony. Millions of greenskins toiled there alongside their countless human slaves. Short-lived captives were harvested from interstellar raids and condemned to a brutal, relentless labor that would end up killing them. The planet's strategic importance lay in its abundance of resources, critical for fueling both Orc war machines and future potential Imperial campaigns. Recognizing its value, rogue trader Heydrich Zuckerman scouted the planet and presented it as a priority target for the expanding Great Crusade. In 807 M30, the Emperor himself led a massive multi-legion assault on the Orc-controlled territories, a campaign which was known as the Seraphian Offensive. The Seraphian Offensive itself marked one of the earliest examples of large-scale coordinated Imperial warfare, as 11 Space Marine legions were simultaneously supported by hundreds of Imperial Army battle groups, and they all launched simultaneous strikes across scores of Orc-held worlds. Their objective was simple: fracture the Greenskins' forces and destroy each and every Orc encampment in order to annihilate the Empire piecemeal before they could mount an effective counteroffensive. To the 10th Legion fell the daunting task of claiming Rust. They were supported by two secondary Imperial forces, the Ursuran Valtis of the Imperial Army and the Helginian Covenant of the Legio Cybernetica. This mission was not only to eradicate the Orcs, but it was also geared to liberate as many enslaved humans as possible, estimated by some at that point to number near 1 billion souls. Under the leadership of Lord Commander Adamus Duquesne, the 10th Legion advised a strategy rooted in a merciless doctrine which mirrored those used in Old Albia, a tactic that later would be remembered as Hammer and Storm. The plan was as precise as it was devastating. The Hammer was the Legion's own armored spearhead, driving into the heart of the Orcs' defenses, while the Storm would unleash a relentless wave of infantry and support units to encircle and annihilate any who remained. The battles on this planet would rage across the toxic landscape for days, and the air would become thick with smoke and acid tangs of burning metal. Yet, despite the Orcs' natural ferocity and seemingly limitless numbers, the 10th Legion's disciplined execution and tactical brilliance proved instrumental, as the Greenskins would throw wave after wave of warriors into the fray. But their efforts were ultimately in vain, as when their machines ran out of fuel, their warriors would be quickly out of blood, and the Cruded Claw Empire would lose its hold on Rust. The Battle of Rust was heralded as an Imperial triumph, not merely for the overwhelming victory, but for the efficiency in which it was achieved, due to the extreme lack of casualties, as the 10th Legion had suffered casualties amounting to less than 1/5 of their deployed strength, a figure that was astoundingly low given how well defended the planet was and the scale of the conflict. This victory showcased the Legion's cold efficiency and unyielding discipline, along with their ability to leverage their environment and resources to devastating effect. Rust's liberation also had significant humanitarian implications. Though the toil of Orc enslavement had devastated the local populaces, those humans who survived were freed and integrated quickly into the expanding Imperium, their suffering avenged through the Legion's wrath. When being analyzed, it seems that the Battle of Rust solidified the 10th Legion's reputation as a remorseless and methodical fighting force, capable of overwhelming even the most entrenched enemy positions. This engagement not only demonstrating their growing mastery of large-scale warfare, but also set a precedent for the devastating effectiveness they would continue to display throughout the Great Crusade. The 10th Legion's campaign on Rust stands as one of the most calculated and brutal demonstrations of the emerging military philosophy of the Iron Hands. Already seasoned against the Orc menace, the Legion, under the command of Lord Commander Adamus Duquesne, brought to bear a strategy rooted in Old Albia's tactical brilliance. However, that would not be the last time they used such tactics. The tactic would go as follows. The first phase of an operation would begin with an orbital bombardment, a hallmark of the 10th Legion's tactical doctrine. Their warships would rain destruction upon the surface of the planet, targeting key fortifications and supply hubs. This was not merely an act of devastation, but a calculated provocation designed to draw out the enemy from any defensive positions into open battle. The following would lead the deployment of the Imperial Army in particular. in full strength directly onto the planet's surface. Duquesne would order them to establish a triangular deployment zone, and on Rust, that was within the wasteland plains, strategically positioned between the 3 largest orc settlements within the remnants of the planet's few cities. With the Ursharan forces digging in deep, they would create a defensive line that bristled with artillery and fortified encampments. This would act as a deliberate bait and would be seen as a gauntlet being thrown at the fleeing enemies of the 10th, which not only applied to orcs, but almost every time that they deployed this tactic, it would function in the same way. However, it was extremely effective at goading the orcs' warlike nature to overwhelm their better senses, as the greenskins would surge forth in the millions, spurred on by the audacious challenge, and within hours the barren plains became a hellish battlefield, choked with smoke and countless explosions along with the screams of the dying. Craters would be filled with the shattered remnants of men and Xenos alike, as the orc warbands hurled themselves against the defensive positions with reckless abandon. Despite the casualties and the desperate calls for reinforcements, the Iron Hands would always remain resolute, refusing to commit the Legion's full strength until the orcs' forces were fully exposed. Observers in orbit would watch each and every time this would occur, as the enemy hordes would eventually swell, leaving a tide of dead bodies spreading across the wasteland, consuming it in shadow. On Rust, it was only when the orcs' numbers reached their peak did the Iron Hands unleash the second phase of their plan. With the enemy committed and their warbands spread thin across the plain, the 10th Legion would descend like a thunderbolt. The skies above Rust would burn as Stormbird gunships would deliver wave after wave of legionary into the fray. Armored spearheads along with land raiders and Sicarian battle tanks crashed into the orc lines as suddenly as they had appeared, shattering what little cohesion the greenskins or any opponent faced with a hammer and thunderstorm strike would witness. This would be the tactic that the Legion would become famous for. The battlefield itself would become a chaotic melee where just hours earlier it was becoming a slaughter. The orcs, deprived of their leaders and overwhelmed by the Legion's superior firepower and discipline, would begin to falter. Like any enemy faced with such a threat, what had once been an unstoppable tide of savagery would be reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, hunted down by the Legion's methodical forces. However, to go into further detail on Rust in particular, the Imperial forces had to go through a storm of orc anti-air fire and swarming aerial predators. The gunships of the Legion and their landers would need to descend with unyielding speed and precision as they pierced the swirling tempest of destruction, tearing a path towards the very heart of the orcs' stronghold. At the core of the armored formations were both Malkador and Mauler tanks. In the shadow of the advancing armored column, the battle's secondary elements would spring into action as the skimmer and jetbike squadrons of the Legion surged outwards, extending their reach to the flanks and rears of the hammer column. The mission would be twofold: to ensure no surviving orc pockets would be left to regroup, and to secure the integrity of the Legion's own spearhead. Meanwhile, the Legio Cybernetica would descend next. With its formidable battle automata, they would lend their might to the sweeping actions to eliminate any remaining enemies. With the resounding victory at Rust, their battle tactics became solidified. The 10th Legion honed their strategy and martial identity further during the expansive Seraphenic offensive. Here they employed the devastating hammer and storm strategy once again, demonstrating the calculated precision and unrelenting discipline which had earned them such renown against the remaining orcs of the Recruited Claw Empire. The Legion's panache for remorseless and highly coordinated warfare became not merely a tool, but the signature of their rising fame. The 10th Legion's mastery of what they would refer to as set-piece battles, especially those incorporating integrated armored vehicle support, became a defining hallmark of any battlefield they were on. Their successes, particularly against orcs and other aggressive species, were studied extensively by other legions, notably the 4th and the 13th, to the point that they would adopt elements of the 10th's strategy within their own campaigns and military doctrine. During and after the destruction of the Recruited Claw Empire, however, The application of these methods were not universal. Some legions, whether due to their distinct temperaments or their own ingrained fighting styles, including the lack of certain discipline and cohesion between larger elements of said legions, found the precise and methodical approaches to war that the 10th Legion were proponents of to be ill-suited to their capabilities. Either out of pride or differing priorities, they would ignore the lessons learned by the 10th entirely. And so the lack of widespread adoption would only serve to further distinguish the 10th as a uniquely disciplined and cohesive armored force. And as it grew, their identity would take shape. Amongst their constant allies were the Ushran, a division of the Imperial army who had fought beside them constantly, to the point that they began to build a reverence towards the Iron Hands, verging on superstition. These soldiers, having witnessed the 10th Legion's calculated ferocity firsthand, coined the moniker Stormwalkers. The name would evoke their mastery over the tempestuous chaos of battle, and to the storm-like sounds which were so interlinked with their combat doctrine, thanks to the constant barrage of artillery and heavy guns. This title would not only encapsulate the awe their human counterparts held for the 10th Legion, but it would quickly spread beyond said human contingent and become as synonymous with the Legion as the Revenant Legion's own title was.
They are not my hands. This fact is forgotten by my brothers. Inexplicably, it has always seemed to me the hands are strong, to be sure, and have created great things for us all. But they are not mine, and that counts for something. They forget that the silver on my arms comes from a beast that I vanquished. It is a mark of a great evil that I ended, and yet it persists with me. I would struggle to remove it now. I will not remove the silver from my flesh because I have learned to depend on it. The fault is with my mind. I rely on the augmentation given to me by my metal gauntlets so much that the flesh beneath them is now little more than a distant memory. A day will come when I will strip it from me, lest I lose the power to master myself forever. Already my legion's warriors replace their shield hands with metal in my honor. And so they too are learning to doubt the natural strength of their bodies. They must be weaned off this practice before it becomes a mania for them. Hatred of what is natural, of what is human, is the first and greatest of the corruptions. So I record it here. When my time comes, I will strip my hands of their unnatural silver. I will instruct my legion to recant their distrust of the flesh. I will turn them away from the gifts of the machine and bid them relearn the masteries of flesh, bone, and blood. When my father's crusade is over, this shall be my sacred task. When the fighting is done, I shall cure my legion and myself. For if fighting is all there is, if we may never pause to reflect on what such devotion to strength is doing to us, then our compulsion will only grow.
Excerpt from the Nemiriel Scrolls attributed to Primarch Ferrus Manus. The 10th Legions of Space Marine, later known as the Iron Hands, were in large part shaped by their genetic legacy and their direct interactions with Primarch Ferrus Manus. Like his 19 gene siblings, Ferrus was crafted from the gene seed whose genetic lineage can be traced back to the Emperor of Mankind, and he would function as a living embodiment of the Emperor's grand design for humanity. However, the story of Ferrus Manus, and indeed all the Primarchs, was marked by tragedy from its inception, as before the Great Crusade could take shape, the catastrophic event would unfold, all thanks to the universe's worst mother. The Primarchs, still in their gestation pods, within the Emperor's secret gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, were scattered across the galaxy. This dispersal, orchestrated by their very gene mother, sent each capsule hurtling into the void straight through hell, stranding the Emperor's creations on distant, isolated worlds. It was through the fateful touch of chaos that some of these Primarchs would be mutated, and it was thanks to the interaction of this very chaotic series of events that the seeds of corruption in many Primarchs were ultimately set, said seeds being the impetus for the Horus Heresy and the betrayal that would sunder the nascent Imperium. The journey journey of Ferrus Manus began on the geologically unstable and storm-racked feral world of Medusa, located within Segmentum Obscurus and rather near the dreaded Eye of Terror. His gestation capsule tore through Medusa's cloud-choked skies, in essence becoming a fiery harbinger of his arrival. The impact was rather cataclysmic as the mountain summit shattered, sending molten steam and ice cascading into the desolate landscape below. Medusa itself seemed to convulse in response to this legendary arrival, as the planet's tectonic plates heaved, toppling mountains and opening vast chasms. According to Medusan lore, the tremors of Ferrus Manus' landing reshaped the world, leaving scars that would endure for millennia to come. Years later, Ferrus Manus emerged from the icy northern wastelands where the ice pinnacle once stood, fully grown and already formidable. He descended upon the nomadic clans of Medusa, which were defined by their harsh and unyielding nature. The Medusans, scattered and perpetually at war with one another, were awestruck by the towering figure who came from the mountains. They named him Ferrus Manus, or Iron-Handed, in ancient High Gothic, a moniker that would become as much his identity as his title. Ferrus quickly gained a reputation amongst the clans as an unmatched and peerless warrior, a figure of nigh unending strength, the hero of the Medusan people, as his feats were the stuff of legends, which were told from father to son as fireside tales. Manus would seek challenges wherever he could, driven by a relentless, almost inborn desire to test himself against the limits of both man and nature. Yet he would be victorious in every trial, allowing Manus to become a living myth. One of the most enduring legends speaks of Ferrus challenging a storm giant to a contest of strength. The giant, a towering ancient, lifted an entire mountain between its hands and set it down a mile away. What became of that contest remains unclear, and what that giant truly was is up to speculation, but the tale would underscore Ferrus's unending hunger for a worthy opponent, and his insatiable drive to overcome what was deemed impossible. Now, to understand Ferrus, we must look into the world itself, Medusa. Medusa itself would mirror much of the character of its adopted son, a world of perpetual storms and shifting tectonic plates where there was an endless and permanent struggle for survival. It forged its inhabitants into a hard, resilient people. This brutal environment shaped Ferrus Manus into an embodiment of unyielding, unending strength, both physically and that of the mind. His story was not merely one of physical power, but a relentless refusal to succumb, regardless of the trials he faced. Ferrus Manus would become a leader and a living embodiment of Medusa's unforgiving ethos. His early exploits, unlike his legions, are rather shrouded in myth and legend, recounted only as odd whispers, but they were merely the first few chapters in the saga of a Primarch who would leave an everlasting mark on the galaxy, despite being the first to fall. In the records of the Imperium's history, few figures tower as large, both literally and figuratively, as Ferrus Manus. His feats, even before becoming the leader of the 10th Legion, were the stuff of legend, from defeating titanic beasts, contests of strength unknown to the rest of the universe, and craftsmanship of peerless quality. Far and wide were many of the legends surrounding Ferrus Manus, and as he became well known around Medusa, people would gather towards him, as Medusa was a world of warlike clans where survival depended on raw power and resilience, and these traits were seen by many to be epitomized by Ferrus Manus, a larger-than-life figure of both stature and deeds, earning him a place within the hearts and minds of all the Medusan tribes. Yet it was not fear alone that granted him this status, as Ferrus Manus demonstrated a wisdom that transcended brute force. Despite his extraordinary power, Ferrus refused to interfere in the constant skirmishes between the clans. To him, their struggle was not a sign of weakness, but of vitality, a crucible in which Medusa's strength was forged. This impartial stance earned him an almost universal acceptance, a rare feat within a land rife with conflict. Over time, he would in essence be adopted by every clan, not merely as a figure of admiration, but truly as one of their own. His neutrality, along with his unmatched strength, elevated him to the status that bordered on the mythic. Scholars have often drawn comparisons between the harsh environments of Medusa and Doctrine to the world that shaped Vulcan, yet another Primarch, as both planets were marked by their savage terrains and primal cultures, due to being shaped by millennia of isolation during the Age of Strife. Yet despite these surface similarities, the people of these two worlds were remarkably and strikingly different. Where the sons of Medusa were fractured and warlike, the people of Nocturne were bound by a sense of community and shared purpose. Ultimately, Medusa's unforgiving nature forged Ferrus Manus into a being of unbreakable resolve. The trials of his youth would become legends in the imaginations of the Medusan people. At this point, the stories surrounding Ferrus Manus are recounted in a harsh oral tradition, and they paint a picture of a figure whose arrival on the world was that of equal drama to his legacy. According to Medusan tales, the Primarch did not descend into the inhabited clan ranges, but instead he came to rest on the northern polar regions of the planet. As his arrival shattered the mountain, which was regarded by Medusans with fear and superstition, believing that it was the place where malignant spirits dwelled, and where there were slumbering monsters of iron. Thus, even just him landing on the planet made Ferrus Manus' journey one as epic as any ancient Terran folklore. From the fractured fields of the north, legends describe that Ferrus wandered the frozen wastes, facing challenges that were as much a test of cunning as they were of his prodigious strength. Tales speak of battles against colossal storm giants, encounters with relic monsters from bygone ages, and mechanized abominations buried deep beneath the ice. Amongst these stories, none stands out as vividly as his confrontation with Asen Roth, the great silver worm. Asen Roth is central to the Canticle of the Travelers, an epic Medusan poem passed down throughout the generations. This monstrous worm, clad in skin of living metal, was said to possess a resilience greater than the finest armor forged by human hands. Legends tell that Ferrus Manus tracked the creature for days through the fabled Land of Shadows, a realm described as a haunting expanse of colossal ancient relics forged of metal and stone, and said land was said to be a place of mystery and unforgiving terror. Said land was steeped in the essence of the ghosts of the Medusan ancestors. Modern Imperial scholars have drawn striking parallels between the descriptions of the Land of Shadows in the Canticle and Necron tomb worlds, discovered millennia later. The massive metallic constructs shared a striking similarity of Necron creations, and the descriptions of the ghostly presences suggest the place might have been a site of a Necron ruin, or perhaps a resting place for a Catan shard. If true, this provides context for Asen Roth's existence, as the beast itself may have been a Necron construct forged from necrodermis, a form of living metal unique to the ancient race. The Canticle recounts a titanic struggle between Ferrus Manus and the Great Worm, a battle where raw strength alone would prove insufficient. Though Ferrus struck the beast with the full force of his fury, his blows failed to make any discernible impact on its metallic hide. Ferrus fought with the worm, displaying not only his unparalleled physical might, but also his deep determination and his ingenuity in equal measure. The battle would culminate in a finale where, with a final desperate act of cunning, Ferrus lured the Great Worm into the edge of a molten river, using the environment itself as a weapon. With an immense effort, he would force the creature into the lava flow, enduring unimaginable pain as he sunk the creature and his hands into the magma, which would sear his own flesh. Asen Roth was then consumed by the heat, its living metal body disintegrating in the inferno. When the battle was over, Ferrus discovered that the worm's molten necrodermis had flowed onto his arms during the beast's destruction. When Ferrus withdrew his arms from the lava, he noticed that they were transformed, as the necrodermis had now permanently fused with his arms, up to his forearm, creating a seamless blend of flesh and living metal, stronger than the hardest ceramite, yet more flexible than skin. The Canticle claims that the transformation marked not only Ferrus's body, but his very essence, as his eyes, once a mortal shade, became a brilliant silver, their pupils vanishing as the metal seemed to integrate into his very physiology, making the concept of Ferrus ever removing the necrodermis fully from his form potentially impossible. Modern Imperial scholars have debated the implications of Ferrus Manus' encounter with Asen Roth. The prevailing theory posits that the Great Worm was indeed a legendary Necron construct, possibly a guardian entity or even a herald of a dormant Catan shard. The necrodermis which is known to be semi-sentient, likely bonded with Ferrus at a fundamental level, not only physically but spiritually as well, altering him in ways that remain unclear to this day. Some argue that the transformation may have corrupted him, though what form such corruption might take is a subject of severe speculation. For Medusans, however, the story of Asen Roth is a source of pride and reverence. It illustrates the rather indomitable spirit of their adopted hero. The myth of Asen Roth is not merely a tale of triumph, but it is a glimpse into the intersection between ancient alien technologies and the Primarch's destiny, whether Asen Roth was a relic of the Necrons or something far older. Its defeat at Ferrus's hands marked a pivotal point for his rise to greatness, a moment where flesh met metal and history was changed forever. When Ferrus emerged from the frozen desolation of the Northern Realms, he was no longer merely a wandering legend, but a figure of supreme authority upon the world. Known amongst the clans as the Gorgon, it was known that he did not seek their reverence as a deity, though many regarded him as such. Instead, he demanded their obedience, and any who dared defy his will were met with harsh and ruthless violence. His rise was not one of peace or unification, but of harsh domination, forged through trials of blood and fire. Ferrus saw value in the ceaseless conflicts that defined Medusa's clan-driven society, and so he would not bring an end to their warring ways. Rather, he sought to elevate their struggles, ensuring that only the strong would endure. To achieve this end, he worked closely with the Iron Fathers, the spiritual and technological leaders of the Medusan clans. These individuals were a particular fusion of shamanistic mysticism and pragmatic engineering. Ferrus shared with the Iron Fathers the knowledge he had gained during his travels and experiments. His teachings yielded wonders, powerful weapons, and advanced machines, along with techniques that reshaped the Medusan ability to thrive in their harsh environment. With his living metal hands, Ferrus demonstrated the ability to manipulate and shape raw materials into intricate tools and devices without the aid of a hammer or a forge. This extraordinary ability enabled the clans to achieve feats of engineering they had never dreamed as possible. Under his tutelage, Medusa entered an unprecedented age of technological advancement. The once scattered and warring clans grew stronger and were tempered by their newfound technological prowess, and the unforgiving trials of their brutal world were extended, reshaped even, into a new form. But Ferrus would not grant these gifts freely. Those who wished to benefit from his guidance had to prove their worth through the continued struggle and survival that the world had become so known for, a philosophy that would later define the culture of the Iron Hands. Ferrus Manus did not confine his ambitions to the surface of Medusa, as he would lead the bravest of its warrior clans into the frozen underworld, seeking the remnants of the ancient machines buried beneath millennia of ice and ruin. These expeditions were fraught with peril, as the depths were the homes of horrors of forgotten ages. Warrior bands encountered degenerate mutants, living dead cyborgs whose decayed flesh hung in tatters from their ruined mechanical forms, which some scholars believe might have been Necron flayed ones, and colossal dark engines, all these ancient constructs of a nightmarish age long past. Despite these terrors, Ferrus Manus led his people to victory time and time again, through both strength and his unmatched brilliance. The spoils of these exploits, the salvaged materials and ancient technologies, along with fragments of lost knowledge, became the foundation upon which the Medusan clans would continue to thrive. Each conquest reinforced the Gorgon's reputation as a warlord and a sage, a figure who was a blend of brutal force and unparalleled intellect. By the time that the Emperor of Mankind was to come to Medusa during the Great Crusade, Ferrus Manus had already transformed the planet, as he was a warlord, a teacher, and a living embodiment of Medusa's own culture. Yet the legends suggest that Ferrus was not surprised by the Emperor's arrival. It is said that he suspected the true purpose of his creation, understanding that his destiny would lay beyond. When the Emperor would come to claim Ferrus Manus as one of his gene sons, there would be no resistance, only readiness, as Ferrus had forged himself and his world into something extraordinary, a testament to the iron within his will. Said iron defined him, and it would define how he tested himself against the trials of not only Medusa, but those handed to him by the Emperor. Ferrus Manus would leave a world that bore his indelible mark. The Medusan clans, now armed with even more advanced technology, were strengthened and became ready to face nigh impossible trials, and they would become the foundation for his future legion, the Iron Hands, as their culture reflected the lessons he wished to impart upon his gene sons. For the Gorgon, Medusa was more than just a world, or even a home. It was a crucible, and a proving ground where his strength, intellect, and will would be tempered, along with that of his gene sons. It was here that he prepared for his larger role in the galaxy, not only as a Primarch, but as a legend whose name would echo throughout the history of the Imperium. The people of Medusa would know no peace, but they were no strangers to portents. When the sky was split for a second time in their history, echoing the moment Ferrus Manus arrived on the world, the clans were gripped by an uncertainty, as this was no ordinary event, and it bore the unmistakable weight of significance. Without hesitation or explanation, Ferrus Manus departed from the clans, making his way towards the phenomenon's epicenter. Weeks would pass with uneasy silence, as rumors began to swirl amongst the clans that their savior's absence may have a deeper meaning, stoking fears of abandonment. Then the natural order of the world seemed to rebel. Titanic electrical storms lashed out from the heavens, their bending arcs mirrored by quakes that rumbled throughout Medusa's very bones. For 8 days and nights, the planet seemed on the verge of tearing itself apart. Then suddenly, as it began, the chaos ceased, and an unnatural stillness blanketed the world. A silence so profound that it unnerved even the hardiest of Medusans. On the 9th day, Ferrus Manus returned, yet he was not alone. By his side stood a figure unlike any the clans had ever seen, the Emperor of Mankind, a being radiating authority and power. The Emperor's presence left an impression upon all those who witnessed him. Whatever transpired between these two titanic figures in the remote mountains remains shrouded in a large amount of ambiguity, in large part due to how oral tradition functions. However, most accounts converge on a single theme, a trial of strength and will, one so intense that it unleashed storms and quakes which ravaged the planet. What is certain, though, is that the bond forged by Ferrus Manus and the Emperor was rather deep. When they descended upon high from the mountain ranges together, it was clear that the Gorgon had found a purpose greater than the harsh dominion he had crafted on Medusa. For the first time, Ferrus's stern resolve seemed to be tempered by the acknowledgement of a peer, perhaps even a father. The Emperor had come not merely for the retrieval of his son, but to offer him a destiny amongst the stars. Ferrus Manus would leave Medusa shortly thereafter, journeying with the Emperor to Terra, the cradle of humanity, and the true world of his origin. Yet before his departure, he promised the clans that he would return, for Medusa had forged him, as surely as he had shaped its people, and it would remain his home. Its harsh lessons had been etched into his very being. Ferrus's discovery would mark a significant moment within the Great Crusade, as he was amongst the earliest of the Emperor's lost sons to be found. Like Horus Lupercal and Leman Russ before him, Ferrus Manus had already risen to prominence as a warlord in his own world. Yet, unlike many of his brothers, Ferrus Manus approached his newfound role with a methodical precision and fervent determination that were honestly awe-inspiring to many of them, including the eventual War Master, Horus Lupercal. Upon returning to the stars, Ferrus Manus was granted command of the 10th Legion, which at the time was remarked to be one of the Emperor's mightiest Astartes legions. The transition from planetary warlord to one of the generals of the Great Crusade was almost seamless for the Gorgon. His analytical mind and unyielding discipline, along with the hunger for challenge, drove him to reshape the Legion in his image. Ferrus would approach this task with the same meticulous intensity that had defined every aspect of his character. He dismantled the Legion's existing structure with a precision of an artisan, deconstructing the complex mechanisms and analyzing each component before reassembling it into a form that better suited his vision. Under his command, the 10th Legion would become a reflection of its Primarch, a relentless, disciplined, and uncompromising force, one which was guided by its pursuit of perfection. When Ferrus assumed command of the 10th Legion, his vision for the future was as harsh as the world that shaped him. Like many of his brother Primarchs, Ferrus chose his foster world, Medusa, as the foundation upon which he would reshape his legion. But his approach was anything but conciliatory. In uniting the Terran-founded Astartes with the nomadic Medusan clans, Ferrus forged a new identity for the legion, one born from the crucible of hardship that he seemed to be so obsessed with. Ferrus Manus dissolved the legion's existing structures, abolishing the Terran-style chapters and replacing them with clans, a cultural reflection of Medusa's own societal framework. Yet this change was not mere symbolism. It was enforced with a brutal decisiveness. The Terran Space Marines were ordered to subjugate Medusa's existing clan leadership, both secular and spiritual, through displays of sheer might. The battles that followed were not merely skirmishes, but existential trials that tested the worthiness of the Medusan clans to serve their new masters. In time, the Iron Hands would become a hybrid entity, its foundation rooted in the values of Medusa while retaining the technological expertise and disciplines of its Terran origins. The Astartes walked amongst the Medusan clans as demigods, towering figures who demonstrated both obedience and sacrifice. Life under the Iron Hands would become one of a relentless and unending struggle, but it also offered the clans a chance to contribute to something far greater than themselves. For the Medusan people, survival alone was not the goal anymore. Instead, they fought to endure so they may prove their worth, hoping that their children may ascend to the ranks of the Legion someday. The arrival of the Iron Hands would do little to soften the harsh existence of Medusa. Ferrus Manus made no effort and essentially guided his legion to do the same, to follow his example so they may not lessen the suffering of his people, for he believed that hardship was the ultimate crucible through which the weak would be culled, leaving only the strong and resilient. The trials of Medusan life became significantly harsher, ensuring that only those with the necessary physical strength, martial skill, and psychological fortitude to survive would be deemed worthy to enter the Legion. Yet Medusa's small population presented a rather notable logistical challenge. To address this, Ferrus Manus implemented a system of enforced recruitment from conquered worlds. On planets that resisted Imperial compliance, the Iron Hands imposed a tithe of adolescent males, selected by the priests of the Mechanicum. These youths were transported to Medusa, where they were thrown into the same grueling existence endured by the nomadic clans. Here they would be expected to survive the planet's trials and assimilate into its culture, so they may prove themselves worthy. Those who succeeded would become aspirants, eligible to undergo the transformation into Astartes upon reaching maturity. Those who would not would just become nutrients for the world. This system of enforced struggle and brutal selection shaped the Iron Hands into a force of unparalleled discipline and ferocity. The bleak ethos of Medusa became the Legion's creed, passed down to every new generation of warriors. Ferrus Manus ensured that his legion embodied the values of resilience and strength, along with ruthless efficiency. In uniting the 10th Legion and the nomadic clans, Ferrus Manus did more than just forge a fighting force. He created a completely new culture. The Iron Hands would become a living reflection of their Primarch's ideals, and so too would the world itself. Every action a testament to the belief that weakness was unforgivable, and that only through struggle could greatness be achieved. Thus, the legacy of Medusa and its grim creed would endure well into the 42nd millennium. Records of the Imperium's Great Crusade history, the bond between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, respectively the Gorgon and the Phoenician, stands as a tale of shared brilliance and profound camaraderie. Their legendary friendship, forged amidst the roaring furnaces of Terra's great forge, would be immortalized evermore, as being a friendship only rivaled between that of Horus Lupercal and Sanguinius. The fateful meeting between these two great Primarchs occurred beneath Mount Norinda, within the mightiest forge of the Urals, and what was a bastion of industry that had once served the Terrawat clan during the Unification Wars. Ferrus Manus, recently arrived from Medusa, was immersed deeply within his craft, demonstrating his nigh unrivaled skill and near miraculous precision granted to him by his living metal hands. His work astounded even the veteran forge masters who toiled alongside him, their awe bordering on reverence for the Primarch's mastery of metallurgy and engineering. Into this, this entered Fulgrim, the Phoenician, accompanied by his elite Phoenix Guard. The Primarch of the Emperor's Children carried himself with a regal bearing of one accustomed to adoration and perpetual victory. Despite the aura of competition that might have flared between these two titanic figures, there seemed to be no hostility. Instead, an unspoken understanding quickly passed between the two, a recognition of their shared genius and common reverence of the alchemical sciences that had played a role in their own creation, along with a love of the forge. The artisans present trembled at the two Primarchs exchanging words, fearing that this meeting of giants might descend into conflict. Ferrus Manus would later recount to his legion how Fulgrim, with his characteristic confidence, proclaimed his intent to craft the greatest weapon humanity had ever seen, a tool that would embody the perfection his legion sought to emulate. Ferrus, however, dismissed Fulgrim's claim with a booming laugh, mocking his brother's pasty hands as unworthy of such an endeavor, compared to his own living metal limbs. Fulgrim, unperturbed by this jest, accepted the challenge with a smile as radiant as his reputation. Stripping to their waists, the two Primarchs set to work in the forge, surrounded by the roaring heat of the furnaces and the incessant clamor of hammer-striking anvils. For weeks, the forge echoed with relentless cadences of their labor, punctuated by good-natured taunts and a hiss of cooling metal. The artisans watched in awe as these two titans, these demigods, bent raw metals with their wills. Their every movement was a display of transcendent skill. 3 months of unyielding toil would culminate in the creation of two unparalleled weapons. Fulgrim would unveil Forgebreaker, a mighty warhammer capable of shattering mountains with a single strike. Its craftsmanship was a reflection of Fulgrim himself, elegant yet devastating, whereas Ferrus Manus presented Fireblade, a golden sword that burned eternally with a fiery essence drawn from the very forge it was born in. The blade itself was a testament to his relentless pursuit of strength and functionality, its design both flawless in form and purpose. Yet in a moment that revealed the depths of their shared respect, each Primarch declared the other's creation superior. Fulgrim likened Fireblade to the fabled weapon of Nadula Silverhand, a blade fit for a hero of legend. Ferrus in turn proclaimed that Forgebreaker could only be wielded by the thunder gods of Nordic myth. Without hesitation or further debate, the two exchanged their weapons, each carrying the mark of their brother's genius into the Great Crusade from there on. This act of mutual admiration and the exchange itself would symbolize the profound connection between the Gorgon and the Phoenician. Their friendship, forged within the forges of Terra, would endure as one of the Imperium's most storied alliances. For Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, the forge was not merely a place of creation. It was a crucible where their bonds would be tempered, a testament to the unbreakable link between these two extraordinary beings, shaped by fire, metal, and the shared dream for humanity's ascension. Amongst the many legendary weapons created during the Great Crusade, Forgebreaker is still renowned as one of the most formidable and awe-inspiring ever crafted. Forged by Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, it was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of power, artistry, and determination, which would forever mark the bond between the two brothers, one that would eventually be shattered. The sheer weight of Forgebreaker was so immense, only an Astartes, enhanced by the Emperor's genetic mastery, could wield it with great strain, and a Primarch could with some relative ease. Its haft was as dark as the deepest of ebonies, and it was interlaced intricately with both gold and silver filigree. The patterns forged into the hammer itself formed an image of a lightning bolt, a symbol of both divine power and wrath, which it seems Fulgrim believed would best reflect his brother's character. At its head was a mighty eagle, its beak fashioned into a deadly striking face, and its wings tapering into brutal claws. And this great beast was carved with such a perfection that it seemed to pulse with life. For anyone who gazed upon Forgebreaker, they could feel its power, a force that resonated from deep within the weapon, compelling both awe and reverence to be bestowed upon it by all those who witnessed it. It was not merely a tool of war, but rather it was a physical manifestation of the bond Fulgrim at the time felt with Ferrus, embodying the ideas of loyalty, honor, death, and the vengeance humanity would wreak upon the stars, along with the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. In the eyes of the Iron Hands, it was a living legacy and a tribute to Ferrus Manus and the friendship he shared with Fulgrim, and it would become a symbol of the undying, unyielding strength and the alliance that would lead the two legions to so readily work with one another. It is from this shared bond that the name Gorgon would come to haunt Ferrus Manus. While many believe the title was a direct reference to the terrifying creature from ancient Terran mythology, the truth is far more personal, and perhaps more telling of the relationship between Ferrus Manus and his brother Fulgrim. The Gorgon in myth was a creature so hideous that its very gaze could turn men to stone, which it seems Fulgrim believed was a fitting metaphor for the brutal and unyielding nature of Ferrus Manus, but perhaps this interpretation was more of an afterthought. The name's true origin seems to lie in a personal moment, one that occurred shortly after the two Primarchs met beneath the mountain. Upon their return to the Imperial Palace, Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim encountered Sanguinius, the noble and elegant Primarch of the Blood Angels, who had brought with him wondrous gifts for the Emperor. The artifacts were exquisite, beautiful statues crafted from the glowing rocks of Baal, gem-encrusted treasures of the highest order, and rare minerals such as opal, tourmaline, and agrogranite. To Fulgrim, the delicate beauty of these items was a perfect reflection of his own love for art and culture. Yet for Ferrus Manus, these wonders had little appeal, as he saw them as little more than distractions, a waste of precious time in a galaxy that demanded conquest and survival. Amused by his brother's indifference, Fulgrim jested that Ferrus was a terrible gorgon, a being so impervious to beauty that he could not appreciate the very stars he fought to reclaim. The insult, while lighthearted, stuck. To those who knew Ferrus Manus the best, the name was a mark of shame rather than a badge of honor. For the Gorgon was no mere creature of myth, but a warrior, unrelenting and unyielding in his pursuit of the Emperor's very grand design. It was a name forged in a crucible of brotherhood, and, regardless of how he may have acted, it was a testament to Ferrus Manus' singular focus on the task at hand. Thus, the title, the Gorgon, became irrevocably tied to Ferrus Manus. It was a title not given by his enemies, but by a brother whose wit and fondness for beauty could not dissuade him from seeing Ferrus for what he truly was, a figure of formidable strength, tempered by the iron resolve that would shape the Iron Hands and define his legacy throughout the Great Crusade.
You are all my sons, and the fires of the forge burn as hot in your hearts as they do in mine. Chain them, master them, and you shall wield a deadly weapon, but allow them to rule you, and you shall be lost.
Excerpt from Ferrus Manus' address to the 10th Legion before the Garvin Crusade. Under the expert guidance of their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, the 10th Legion would transform into the epitome of a war machine, cold, efficient, and a perfect instrument of destruction. Where the other legions might find beauty in the chaos of battle, the Iron Hands embraced the brutality of precision and order. They would become, more than any other, a literal war engine, a literal engine of war, a purpose-built force designed to destroy in the most direct and relentless manner possible, at the greatest efficiency they could. This transformation, orchestrated by Ferrus Manus, was rooted in his vision for the legions. His command forged a path where warfare was not an art, but a methodical and unstoppable force, guided by reason, discipline, and technological mastery. Under Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands would take pride in their overwhelming superiority, in particular of their weaponry. War gear and combat techniques were also highly attuned to his grand design. The Legion would often be characterized by its cold precision, as they were not only valued for their warriors' physical power, but for the intellectual and technological prowess of the Iron Hands. Said technological expertise became as crucial as bravery and discipline. To the Iron Hands, victory was not something earned through heroism or grace, but through efficiency and ruthlessness. Their mission was simple: to become the hand that reached out and crushed the enemies of humanity, as cold, unfeeling, and implacable as the very metal that coursed through their Primarch's arms. From the very outset, Ferrus Manus' rule was uncompromising and without question, as he became a harsh yet constant overlord, a father figure who demanded perfection from those who served under him. Like the Iron Hands themselves, he was a creature of extremes, swift to anger, unflinching in his expectations, but also rigid of control. His wrath was always close to the surface, yet it was tempered by rationality and his methodical nature, as if his fury was another weapon to wield, precisely when needed. In the eyes of his legion, he was not merely a leader, but a living myth, the Gorgon itself, a figure of monumental stature as his deeds were legendary. To them, this title, originating from his myth-like nature, resounded more to the 10th Legion than its true origin, as it reflected their Primarch's superhuman strength, intelligence, and perseverance. And the legends about him grew as he proved time and time again that his mere gaze, as cold and unyielding as metal, showed that he understood war better than any of his brothers. Ferrus Manus was quick to scorn and slow to offer praise, as he set standards for his legion that were nothing short of unreachable. The warriors under his command were not just soldiers, they were extensions of his will and body, as there was no room for mediocrity or failure within his legion. And this message was hammered into the heads of each and every warrior from the very moment they were inducted to the second they would die. The very strength of the legion came from this brutal creed. Weakness was the ultimate sin. Just as Ferrus Manus had done on Medusa, where he had purged weakness from his dominion, so too would he cleanse his legion and the worlds they conquered of weakness. Failure in the eyes of Ferrus Manus was intolerable, and to the Iron Hands, failure was synonymous with weakness. Weakness, in turn, was the greatest threat to the survival of humanity, a threat that they believed had led them to the catastrophic terrors of Old Night. On Medusa, weakness perished, dragged down by the harsh environment and the unforgiving trials of survival that had so long existed on the world. There, the strong survived and the weak were left behind. This mindset was harsh and would be transplanted into the Iron Hands belief system, where the survival of the Legion, nay, the survival of the Imperium, relied on eradicating all traces of weakness. The warriors of the 10th Legion had internalized the harsh creed that failure was not to be tolerated, and that any form of weakness must be purged, regardless of its origin, to an extreme. This ideology extended to all members of the Legion, including their aspirants. Any sign of frailty in the ranks, any failure to meet standards set by Ferrus Manus, was met with swift and unforgiving punishments. The warriors of the Iron Hands were shaped into an unbreakable force, a tribe of ascendant warriors, forged in the very crucible of discipline that Ferrus Manus had dipped his hands in. They believed that only the strong had the right to carry the Emperor's will, and they believed that it was through this crucible that they would become strong. The severity of Ferrus Manus' creed left an irremovable mark upon the Iron Hands, one that they would carry to this very day. They were not just a legion of warriors, they were a living embodiment of the Primarch's will, a will that could never be swayed by weakness, and a strength that could never be broken. His warriors fought not for glory or honor, but because they understood, as Ferrus Manus did, that victory could only be secured through perfection, discipline, and the will to conquer. Through Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands became more than just soldiers. They became an unstoppable, unyielding force, a weapon honed by years of sacrifice, fearlessness, and the purest embodiment of discipline. Under the steadfast leadership of Ferrus Manus, the 10th Legion would quickly become the heart of the 52nd Expeditionary Fleet during the Great Crusade. With their Primarch, the Gorgon, at their helm, the Iron Hands distinguished themselves as one of the most formidable and efficient weapons in the Emperor's nigh unending arsenal. Known for their ruthlessness and their mastery of high-intensity combat, along with their cold and calculating approach to warfare, the Iron Hands would quickly gain a reputation as one of the Great Crusade's most reliable and decisive legions. Their battlefield tactics were not just efficient, they were absolute perfection, designed to win through force, precision, and unending pressure. The Iron Hands would prove themselves especially effective against enemies that demanded direct confrontation, such as the Orcs, whose overwhelming numbers and sheer physical prowess posed a significant threat to the success of the Emperor's great design. The 10th Legion's abilities in these brutal engagements would be amplified by their understanding of technology in both terms of their own superior war gear and their ability to counter, adapt, and adopt the weaponry weaponry of their enemies into their own equipment. These qualities made them an indispensable tool for the Emperor. As such, the Iron Hands would be swiftly deployed in critical campaigns, often engaged in set-piece battles against technologically advanced foes and large organized Xenos forces. The Legion's combat style thrived in the midst of battle, where the fighting was at its most intense, and it was there on these battlefronts that they would cement their reputation as the Great Crusade's most direct and unyielding, unstoppable force. Recognizing the Iron Hands' prowess, the Emperor strategically positioned them in some of the most difficult and dangerous sectors of war. The challenge of engaging in mass battles against opposing war machines and advanced armies would only help to hone the 10th Legion's effectiveness. As the Legion's reputation for efficiency grew, so did the demand for their services. The Iron Hands were called upon time and time again to engage with enemies that would otherwise overwhelm less specialized forces, especially in battles against human factions that clung to the remnants of lost Dark Age of Technology weaponry. These factions, resistant to the Emperor's unification efforts, represented a particularly dangerous threat to the success of the Great Crusade. The nature of these high-intensity engagements also required the Iron Hands to work rather closely with the Mechanicum and the Titan Legions, an alliance that was born of both necessity and shared interest, which would only deepen throughout time. This collaboration harkened back to Ferrus Manus' early experiences on Medusa, where the harsh environments had shaped his leadership with technological mastery over the course of the entirety of the Great Crusade. These ties would grow stronger and stronger as the Iron Hands would continue to fight alongside their Mechanicum allies in order to counter threats that required both their technological innovation and the engineering expertise of the Mechanicum. The Legion's relationship with the Mechanicum was mutually beneficial. The Iron Hands provided valuable expertise in weaponry and armor, while the Mechanicum shared their vast resources and technological know-how along with their manufacturing capabilities. And as a result, the Iron Hands quickly became renowned not just for their martial prowess, but for their ability as artificers and weaponsmiths. These skills allowed them to innovate new forms of armaments and defenses in the midst of combat, often developing counters to previously unknown enemy technology. When facing weapons that threatened the Legion's very survival, the Iron Hands were quick to analyze and appropriate these technologies, working alongside the Mechanicum to reverse engineer and replicate them for the Imperium's use, which they were able to do at a much greater rate of success than any other Legion or faction within the Imperium, sans the Emperor himself. As the Great Crusade continued, the Iron Hands found themselves working alongside various other legions as well, often as shock troops in major campaigns. In some instances, Ferrus Manus was called upon to take overarching command of the battlefield's very operations, even overseeing other Primarch's joint campaigns. These efforts would go on to foster strong allegiances and friendships with other legions, particularly with the Emperor's children, whose Primarch Fulgrim had already formed a deep bond of respect with Ferrus Manus, and came to rely heavily on his tactical genius. However, not all alliances would prove to be as harmonious as this one. The Iron Hands' growing reputation and their panache for discipline, along with their sometimes overly direct approach to warfare, bred some resentment within certain quarters. Amongst them, the most significant would be the Alpha Legion, whose highly covert and manipulative methods clashed greatly with the Iron Hands' blunt, effective tactics, resulting in friction occasionally threatening to spill over into outright conflict, leaving a lingering sense of mistrust and discord between the two legions. Despite this, the Iron Hands' reputation as one of the most reliable and destructive forces of the Great Crusade would endure, as the Iron Hands would become to be viewed as more than just a legion. They became the embodiment of their Primarch's will, a relentless, unshakable, cold, and calculating force that would crush any obstacle in their way. Despite their many triumphs and unparalleled, almost inhuman efficiency, for which they were known to execute their campaigns with, it became evident that over time the Iron Hands were not suited for every aspect of the Great Crusade. The 10th Legion, once cautious of the costs of their tactics when engaging with allies, had grown indifferent to such considerations. In their pursuit for the greater goal of unifying humanity and bringing about a lasting eternal peace, the Iron Hands Hands embraced a brutal philosophy. The price of victory, no matter how bloody, was justified in the long run. This mindset led them to earn a reputation not only amongst the Imperial army but also their fellow legionaries for being belligerent, impatient, and lacking subtlety, which was often a requisite in complex warfare. Their direct approach, while effective, made them an increasingly unpopular legion, with those who preferred more diplomatic, less violent methods and more tactful, along with more tactically sound military tactics. As the years passed, the Iron Hand's reputation for ruthlessness would solidify further and further still. However, this was not seen in the same light as the unbridled bloodlust of the World Eaters, the catastrophic cost of war waged by the Death Guard, or the unpredictable nature of the White Scars. The Iron Hand's indifference to collateral damage caused by their campaigns, along with their single-mindedness and their overwhelming focus on conquest rather than liberation, set them apart. They became conquerors, not liberators, a distinction that the Legion readily accepted, but which left a bad taste with many of the other legions. Ferrus Manus himself viewed the Great Crusade as a straightforward task: expand the Imperium's borders and crush its enemies without concern for the political machinations or ramifications of the imperial court, all the while ignoring the pursuit of glory. In fact, he once famously summed up his approach to the crusade as, "We make war and move on, and again until nothing breathes which stands against us. All else is sophistry and pretty lies." The Iron Hand's disdain for politics and diplomacy, along with the subtleties of the imperial effort, became an increasingly apparent detriment as the Great Crusade progressed. While other legions engaged in efforts to win the hearts and minds of their newly unified world, the Iron Hands had little interest in such pursuits, as they believed their role was clear: to bring war to the enemies of humanity and leave the aftermath, the rebuilding, and the restoration of order, along with the nurturing of those conquered, to others who were more suited for the task. Their focus and methods essentially ignored all these aspects of the Great Crusade. As the Great Crusade would wear on, the Iron Hands were in a constant service at the front lines, often at the head of their own battle groups, task forces of compliance, or parts of larger expeditionary fleets, fighting alongside other legions as needed. Over a century of service under their Primarch, the amount of victories the Iron Hands had would become difficult to quantify, not only because of their sheer volume, but due to the Legion's growing insular nature. More than once, the Legion's operations were conducted in secrecy, and the details of said campaigns were rarely shared with the wider Imperium. To the public eye, the Iron Hands presented themselves as cold, implacable machines, calculating and powerful engines of war, uninterested in the trivial concerns of the greater humanity within politics or even glory. In fact, the Iron Hands took a great care to keep their affairs shrouded in secrecy and anonymity. Their internal operations were often kept so private that many of their victories remain as of yet unrecorded, their achievements known only to those directly involved. This was not an act of pride or arrogance alone, but a reflection on their deep-seated belief in the singularity of their purpose: to destroy the enemies of the Imperium without distraction or deviation. In this way, the Iron Hands epitomized the relentless and unforgiving nature of war, all the while focusing on the eradication of all threats to the future of humanity. During the Great Crusade, many human worlds, and in some cases entire interstellar empires, resisted the Emperor's vision for the Imperium. Driven by either fear, fanaticism, or pride, they would resist. Amongst these defiant powers was the solar empire of Grendiel, located at the edge of the Dominion of Storms to the galactic east. This empire, comprising of 11 inhabited worlds, had thrived on the industrial power inherited from the Age of Strife, and its military aristocracy had become both formidable and deeply entrenched in their defiance of the Imperium's greater cause. The Empire's strength made it a tempting target for the Emperor's forces, who sought to incorporate it into the growing Imperium. Recognizing the Empire's potential, the Emperor directed the 413th Expeditionary Fleet to take the first step into incorporating the Empire by initiating diplomatic negotiations. A full imperial delegation accompanied by an honor guard of 1,000 Sons was dispatched to Grandil. Initially, talks between both parties appeared rather promising. However, it quickly became apparent that the lords of the system were playing a dangerous game of obstruction, likely to stall for the time they needed while secretly preparing for war. This suspicion would be confirmed when the 1,000 Sons detachment detected an attempt to subvert their minds through a psychic influence. The 1,000 Sons responded with lethal force, eliminating the delegation and allowing Imperial forces to withdraw, bringing world of the treacherous ambush to the wider Imperium. In response to this unprovoked assault, the Emperor dispatched Master Ulan Cirrus of the Ultramarines Legion to lead the 413th Expeditionary Fleet against Grindel, accompanied by a strong Imperial army contingent, including Marion Arsman and Tyrannic Petalis, as well as a demi-legio of Titan Legio Articus. They would be set out to neutralize this threat. The Imperial forces swiftly overcame the defenses of the Empire's outer worlds, establishing a blockade in orbit. However, the Ultramarines attempted to launch an assault on their prime world. Unfortunately, this would lead to a rather difficult encounter, as they faced formidable resistance, fueled by a powerful and unfamiliar SCC which provided rather advanced weaponry and vehicles. These advanced weapons allowed them to repel the Imperium's forces, causing them to have to retreat. Nearly half of the Titan Demi-Legio was destroyed in the engagement, and the Ultramarines suffered catastrophic casualties. Worse still, 500,000 Imperial Army soldiers lay dead. With their assault halted, the Ultramarines called for reinforcements, and Ferrus Manus, along with his Iron Hands, answered the call. Leading an armada comprised of both Iron Hands and Emperor's children, Ferrus Manus brought a new war host to bear on Grandil. The Emperor's children would launch a diversionary assault, sowing chaos and destruction across the world, all the while leaving the infrastructure largely intact. Taking advantage of this diversion, Ferrus Manus led his own Iron Hands directly in a relentless assault on the world's industrial zones in order to take them over with the least amount of damage to them. The Iron Hands would engage in a brutal campaign of attrition, fighting 1,000 separate engagements across the surface of the very world simultaneously. The lords of this small pocket empire, realizing that their resistance was futile, offered up an unconditional surrender to the Imperium. Yet Ferrus Manus, driven by the belief in the importance of absolute submission, refused to accept this, as he ordered his legion to press on the final assault upon the capital world's capital city. The Ultramarines, seeking redemption for their earlier failure, requested the honor of leading the charge into the enemy's citadel, which Ferrus Manus graciously granted. However, the price was steep, as the defenders, unwilling to surrender without a final stand, mounted a rather fierce counterattack, costing the Ultramarines dearly. Their losses were rather significant, but in the end, the lords of Grandil paid the price for their transgressions. After the fall of the ruling class, Ferrus Manus delivered a chilling command: "It is done." With the conquest complete, the Iron Hands and their entire fleet departed from the system. Though the planet faced immediate hardship and famine, this system would become a valuable addition to the Imperium, serving as a future model for Imperial compliance. The once defiant Empire, now broken and pacified, would stand and be made as witness to the testament to the cost of defiance against the Emperor's will, a will enforced by the dreaded Iron Hands. There was also the tale of Valtel Geron Tentrus, which stands as one of the most tragic and shocking incidents of the Great Crusade. When the Imperium first entered the Ordani cluster, the forces of the Emperor encountered Tarentus, a formidable warlord commanding a vast dominion. Faced with the overwhelming might of the Imperium, Tarentus, calculating and clever as ever, chose the path for survival and surrendered to the Imperium's forces. His decision, however, was marked by a beginning of a rise that would see him wield power and influence in the galaxy far greater than he had previously. Over the course of the next 5 decades, Tyrantus expanded his reach, conquering worlds in the name of the Emperor, establishing himself as a warlord of far greater renown than he had ever had before. In the height of his power, he was a figure of rather profound influence within the Imperium, as his conquests brought him into the good graces of some of the Emperor's most powerful figures, including that of Malcador the Sigillite. He also earned the respect of many of the Emperor's sons, the Primarchs, who saw him as a potential long-lived ally. But behind this veneer of loyalty, he had begun to cultivate a darker ambition. When the power of the Imperium had firmly solidified and the Great Crusade had spread its reach, Tyrantus began to deviate from his own oath of allegiance. Instead of working to consolidate the Emperor's gains, he turned against the Imperium and began a Contra Crusade, a campaign to seize already compliant worlds and forge a new empire for himself. His rebellion came as a shock to many, including the Imperium's highest authorities. In response to this act of treason, the Imperium mobilized its forces to deal with the rising threat. Horus, the War Master and Primarch of the Luna Wolves, was chosen to lead this effort to crush a rebellion once loyal, to send the strongest message possible and assure that no one would consider betraying the Emperor's trust again. To ensure the traitor's defeat, Horus commanded a consolidation and coalition of forces including the Luna Wolves Legion, along with the Iron Hands, the Night Lords, and the Alpha Legion. The campaign against this once loyal man and his forces was rather brutal and unrelenting. Tyrantus's rebel empire, was once vast and powerful, began to unravel under the weight of the Imperium's and the Legion's great might. The Night Lords, renowned for their terror tactics, were sent first to strike at the heart of the rebel forces, decimating their warlords and terrifying Tyrantus's realm. The Iron Hands, with their mastery of machines and siege tactics, along with the fearsome Ordo Reductor, were unleashed upon the Bastion worlds, which held the traitors' last remaining strongholds. These worlds, once proud and defiant, fell to the relentless assault. Cities were obliterated and structures reduced to rubble and molten slag. That and the air itself was poisoned with the toxins of war. At the height of the campaign, Horus himself took the lead to bring an end to this pathetic rebellion. With a cadre of 50 elite Justarian warriors in Terminator plate, he teleported directly above the bridge of Tyrantus's flagship, where he confronted the traitor directly, and in a final swift yet brutal confrontation, Horus struck the man down with the talon that would eventually slay a brother, extinguishing the man's plans for rebellion. With the leader of the rebellion slain, the Imperium quickly turned their forces' attention to rooting out the remnants of his empire, leaving behind naught but smoldering ruins. The traitor's fall marked the end for the rebellion, but the devastation left in his wake was a reminder at the cost of defiance. In the aftermath, Horus ensured that the remains of Tentris would serve as a reminder to all those who considered betrayal. The gold-dipped skull of this once proud warlord was sent to Terra as a final symbol of retribution. A messenger bearing the ghastly trophy relayed Horus's chilling message to the Emperor: "So perish all traitors." What sweet irony would these words be merely a few years later? The Ulnar Crusade remains one of the Imperium's most defining campaigns, in particular those within the realm of the Great Crusade. This was a colossal imperial assault against the Orc Empire, ruled by Overlord Uruk, situated within the Ulnar system of the Ulnar sector. The creatively named Ulnar was the capital world of this Orc Empire, and it stood as a major stronghold of the Greenskin menace. The crusade to conquer this marked not only the annihilation of the largest Orc concentration ever faced by Imperial forces, but it also marked the highest point of the Great Crusade and their mission to reunite the fractured colony worlds of humanity. With the victory at Ulnar secured in a clash of blood and iron, the Imperium called for a grand triumph of honor. The immense valor demonstrated by all the warriors within this campaign, both mortal and Astartes, would be celebrated, as 14 of the legions stood at Ulnar, alongside their primarchs, 9 towering figures whose very presence commanded awe and respect. It was in the wake of this spectacular victory that the Emperor made a monumentous decision, Horus Lupercal, the Primarch of the Luna Wolves, was appointed to the title of War Master. This title granted Horus supreme command over all of the Emperor's armies, including authority over the other Primarchs and their expeditionary fleets. The elevation of Horus to War Master was a turning point for many. As the newly appointed supreme commander of all military forces, Horus would oversee the continuation of the Great Crusade, guiding the Imperium's military efforts across the galaxy. But the Emperor's decision was met with surprise and speculation by those present. In a shocking proclamation, the Emperor would then announce his intent to return to Terra, where he was to devote his attention to a secret project he believed would benefit all of mankind. This revelation, paired with Horus's newfound authority, left many questioning how things would go on from there. Amongst those who witnessed this event was Ferrus Manus, and despite what many would think, regardless of his seniority and his overall place in the Emperor's military structure as it stood, did not show any signs of dissatisfaction or even satisfaction at Horus's ascension. Ferrus Manus and his Iron Hands Legion would continue their service alongside Horus and the Luna Wolves without any form of enmity, all the while being led by Ferrus Manus, who resisted the pull of rebellion. Unlike some of the other legions who were compromised by their leaders' ambitions or ideological shifts, the Iron Hands did not fall to the sway of Horus's treachery or even their own ambition. It remains a point of curiosity as to why the traitors believed so strongly that they could sway the Iron Hands to their cause, while they did not attempt the same with other legions. The reasons behind this belief, whether due to the reputation of the Iron Hands themselves, their similarities to the Iron Warriors, and not just in name, or some other factor, remains unclear and may never be fully understood. One can only speculate that Horus saw in Ferrus and his legion a powerful force that could tip the balance of the conflict to come. If the Iron Hands had chosen to side with the traitors, the trajectory of history would likely be irrevocably altered, and the outcome of the Horus Heresy might have been starkly different. As the Great Crusade went on, the Iron Hands encountered a fleet-based civilization known as the Diasporex, comprised of both humans and Xenos. Despite their shared adherence to the Imperial truth and the belief in the Emperor's vision for humanity being united, the Diasporex refused to accept the offer extended by the Iron Hands to abandon their alien allies and join the burgeoning human Imperium. Their rejection was met with a swift and severe retribution. The Iron Hands, in their customary fashion, passed judgment on the Diasporex for their defiance. In the months that would follow, the Iron Hands launched a series of strikes against the nomadic fleet, seeking to obliterate them. However, this fleet proved to be more than capable of evading the Astartes' assaults. Skilled in naval warfare, they managed to outmaneuver the Iron Hands fleet, even inflicting significant damage to the Iron Hands strike cruiser Ferrum. This resilience forced the Imperium to call in reinforcements. In particular, the Emperor's Children, part of the 28th Expeditionary Fleet, responded, and together the Iron Hands and the Emperor's Children began a concerted effort to crush the Diasporex once and for all. Despite knowing the power of the Imperial fleets hunting them, the Diasporex refused to flee the sector, and eventually the Imperium would find out why. They had a singular strategic reason for staying within the solar system. They had a hidden solar collector array which allowed them to harvest fuel from a nearby star. This was vital to their continued operation of their fleet. The Iron Hands and the Emperor's Children, having discovered this critical flaw in the Diasporex military strategy, set about dismantling the fuel stations. The attack on these vital supply points would finally draw the Diasporex fleet into an open and outright battle, where they sought to avoid annihilation at the hands of the Imperium's superior military forces. What followed was a brutal naval engagement, and as the conflict raged, Primarch Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children found himself under a heavy assault while aboard his personal flagship, Firebird. In response, Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands moved to aid his brother, dispatching his flagship, the Fist of Iron, to provide urgent aid to his beleaguered brother's Firebird. In a rare moment of close cooperation between Primarchs, Ferrus and Fulgrim worked together to engage the Diasporix forces in a concerted combined assault. Seeking to restore his wounded pride, Fulgrim led a boarding action aboard the Diasporix ship, where his legion encountered a bloody assault, cutting down enemy forces with brutal efficiency. However, victory would be denied to Fulgrim when the Diasporix ship's bridge was captured by one of his subordinate commanders, and he was not allowed to claim it himself. This act of heroism, done in the spirit of saving his brother, was lost on Fulgrim. The perception of Ferrus Manus' intervention was clouded by the growing arrogance and nigh unending pride of Fulgrim. In the aftermath of the battle, Fulgrim's resentment festered and grew as he struggled to understand the altruistic nature of Ferrus' actions, instead interpreting them as though the intent was personal humiliation. In part, this was due to his growing connection to the chaos-tainted Layer Blade, a weapon that would come to define Fulgrim's eventual corruption, and would be a large part of his further twisted judgment. What Fulgrim saw as Ferrus' attempt to undermine him were in truth merely jests designed to puncture Fulgrim's swollen sense of self-importance and remind him of the humility they both once shared. What Fulgrim could not see was what his pride had obscured. Ferrus had acted selflessly, offering his help not out of pride or desire to overshadow his brother, but out of true camaraderie and care. The Gorgon's actions, though misunderstood, were not motivated by competition or ego, but as a sense of duty and brotherhood. However, this would matter little to Fulgrim, as chaos had already tainted his soul. Following the Emperor's departure from the Great Crusade after the triumph at Ulnor, the Iron Hands, along with the Death Guard and the Salamander's legions, took part in the pacification of the Eldar-controlled world designated as 1544. The task itself was assigned to them due to the necessity to integrate the planet's desert regions into Imperial compliance. However, the campaign was not to unfold as planned. The inhospitable terrain of the world and the elusive battle tactics of the Eldar hindered the Imperial forces. These complications took a heavy toll on Ferrus Manus' legion in particular, leaving them well behind schedule in their efforts to purge the world properly. The Primarch was deeply troubled by the apparent weakness of the Imperial Army's regiments assigned to assist them. Their inability to endure the brutal desert conditions served as an affirmation of the Legion's maxim that the flesh was weak. Determined not to lose face in front of his fellow Primarchs, Mortarion and Vulcan, Ferrus Manus made the decision to abandon the Imperial Army forces should they fail to keep pace with his Astartes. To this end, he dispatched his son, Bion Henkros, to liaise with the regiment's commanding officer, informing him of Ferrus' intentions. This message, however, was not without emotional weight, as Herencross felt a twinge of remorse in delivering it. Meanwhile, Ferrus Manus was beset by troubling dreams, visions that troubled his mind and cast doubt into his legion's effectiveness. Amongst the worries was the possible interference of Eldar witchcraft, which he feared might influence his Astartes' performance, completely putting out of whack his tactical calculations. He confided of these anxieties to his first captain, Gabriel Santor, but did not reveal his deeper unease about the planet itself. The sooner the campaign concluded, he believed, the better, and the quicker his legion could leave this cursed world behind. Unbeknownst to Ferrus, two Eldar had already taken interest in his fate. One of them, seeing the potential for a positive outcome, sought to intervene, while the other cautioned against tampering with the Primarch's path, declaring, "Stone cannot bend, it can only break." The Iron Hands would press onwards into the deep desert. Eventually, they would arrive at a rather suspicious valley, a place Ferrus Manus felt held a significant importance. Though he could not explain why, he would feel reluctant to proceed without a scouting force. He was advised by Herencross to wait for the arrival of the Imperial Army forces, who possessed the necessary units and expertise for such an undertaking. This would also help to bolster the morale for the Imperial Army regiments, giving them a sense of purpose in this arduous campaign. However, Ferrus Manus, unwilling to delay any further, dismissed Herencross's advice and ordered his forces into the valley. As soon as the bulk of the Iron Hand's forces descended, a sudden darkness would engulf them, followed by violent weather that sowed confusion and disarray. The Eldar, lying in ambush, struck swiftly and in close quarters combat, allowing them to deploy mysterious weapons capable of overriding the bionics of the Iron Hands, blinding those who had bionic eyes, and controlling the bionic limbs of the warriors who had replaced them, in order to turn their weapons against their own brethren. The battle seemed all but lost, if not for the timely arrival of Hierarchical's rearguard force, which was able to neutralize the Eldar warlocks responsible for this psychic attack, driving them into retreat. Yet just as the Iron Hands began to regroup, Ferrus Manus was found to be missing, leading to a search being launched. And it was soon discovered that Ferrus had wandered into a cavern deep within the valley, where he was assaulted by a barrage of prescient visions. These visions filled him with knowledge of death, showing the destruction of his legion, his Astartes, and even himself. In the midst of this, Ferrus Manus saw a metaphorical representation of his fellow Primarch, and was struck by an overwhelming sense of betrayal as he gazed upon a statue of Fulgrim. At the same time, Ferrus could feel a malevolent force following him, an ominous serpentine entity that seemed to be stalking him all throughout the cavernous halls. Ignoring the vision's warnings, Ferrus pressed onwards, intent in exploring the cavern further. Meanwhile, First Captain Santor, accompanied by 50 of the Legion's Morlock Terminators, initiated a search for Ferrus, while the legendary Shadrach Meduson, another officer, took command of the Legion's forces and continued the campaign's primary objective in order to destroy the Eldar node complex. However, Santor's search was met with resistance from a powerful protective energy field, which was a formidable Eldar defense that delayed the Iron Hand's progress. Ferrus Manus had continued undeterred, venturing deeper and deeper still into the cavern. Eventually, he was confronted by a serpentine creature that had been haunting him, a massive silver worm. The ensuing battle was fierce, with Ferrus coming dangerously close to death several times. During this confrontation, Ferrus was struck by a sense of deja vu and a vague, unbidden vision in his mind, along with the words Angel Exterminatus echoing throughout his mind, constantly, ad infinitum. Drawing inspiration from his brother Vulcan, Ferrus managed to wound the worm and force it to retreat. Elsewhere, the two Eldar discussed their intervention. While one lamented the failure to prevent the intrusion of chaos, the other was resigned to the inevitable reality. Whether Ferrus succeeded or not, their purpose would not be thwarted. Back on the surface, Brian Hierarchical's force of Imperial Army troops would continue to suffer heavy casualties as they attempted to breach the Eldar's defenses. Hierarchical himself would be grievously wounded, but his bravery ensured that the Eldar threat was significantly weakened. Just as Hierarchical's forces were on the verge of annihilation, Ferrus Manus reappeared, emerging from the caverns, helping to turn the tide of battle, with Santor's reinforcements also joining and arriving shortly thereafter. The Iron Hands would be able to secure victory. As a sign of respect to the surviving Imperial Army troops, Ferrus officially inducted them into the Iron Hands as Chainveil, the first member of the Legion's mortal auxilia forces, living proof that not all flesh is weak. When questioned about his absence, Ferrus Manus remained tight-lipped about it all, dismissing the event as insignificant. Later, when Vulcan made contact with Ferrus and led his forces deeper into the jungle regions of the planet, the Eldar reflected on their failure. With the population of 1544 unwilling to accept the Emperor's vision of truth, Vulcan would be forced to make a grim decision. The planet, once a bastion of resistance, was now to be scoured by flame and renamed Caldera, a dead world, as it was prepared to be terraformed and resettled into the Imperium's service. Eventually, the Horus Heresy would come, and in the early days of the Horus Heresy, as Horus began his rebellion on Isstvan V, Ferrus Manus found himself in an unimaginable position. His closest friend Fulgrim was now an emissary of chaos and his enemy. Ordered by Horus himself, Fulgrim was tasked with swaying Ferrus Manus to the side of the traitor legions. At this time, Fulgrim had already sent the bulk of the 3rd Legion and the 28th Expeditionary Fleet to rendezvous with Horus on Isstvan, while he personally led a small contingent to assist the Iron Hands in retaking the orc-controlled world of Kalindes IV. The bond between the Iron Hands and the Emperor's children had run rather deep, forged over years of brotherhood and shared campaigns. Fulgrim, believing that he had a fraternal connection with Ferrus deep enough that it would allow him to show his brother the righteousness of Horus's cause, arranged a private meeting aboard Ferrus's flagship, the creatively named Fist of Iron. But what Fulgrim had hoped would be a diplomatic turn was quickly shattered by Ferrus's outrage. The Gorgon, as he was known, was staunchly loyal to the Emperor, and the very suggestion of betrayal was enough to ignite his fury, causing him to lose his head. In the sanctity of Ferrus's Anvilism, the two Primarchs clashed violently. Ferrus, unable to fathom Fulgrim's fall to chaos, made his stance clear, drawing his weapon, hoping to stop the rebellion before it could take root. His necrodermis hands clashed with Fulgrim's golden sword, triggering a devastating explosion that left Ferrus unconscious. Fulgrim, however, would choose not to deliver the fatal blow just yet. Despite the urging of the Slaneshi demon now fully corrupting his soul, he could not bring himself to kill his dearest and oldest friend. Instead, in a moment of grim sorrow, he took Forgebreaker away from Ferrus. Fulgrim then left Ferrus behind, signaling his Phoenix Guard to massacre the Iron Hand's elite Morlock Terminators, who were Ferrus's personal guard, before departing aboard his own assault craft into the Firebird. As Fulgrim's forces launched their escape into the warp, they fired down on the Iron Hand's ship, crippling the 52nd Expeditionary Fleet in the process. The betrayal cut deeply, and Ferrus's fury was unimaginable. Then the message from the Emperor arrived, relayed by Rogel Dorn. Time had come for the Loyalists to strike back. The Iron Hands, alongside the Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and others, were sent to confront Horus and his traitors on the world of Isstvan V, with the task of crushing the rebellion in its totality. A second wave would be comprised of the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, and the Word Bearers, who would be sent to support the assault of the initial three Loyalist legions. The Loyalist fleet managed to reach orbit above Isstvan V, and it would be then that the armies of the Emperor would descend upon the planet. Thousands upon thousands of drop pods and stormbirds were launched. As the first wave, under the command of Ferrus Manus, hit the ground, Vulcan's salamanders would assault the flank of the traitors' forces. All the while, Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard would strike at the rightmost segment of Horus's defenses, accompanied by First Captain Gabriel Santor and 10 full companies of elite Morlock Terminators to spearhead the assault to the heart of the enemy's lines. The forces would clash with a fury that was as of yet unmatched, as 40,000 Loyalist Astartes would face against 30,000 traitor Astartes. But Horus was no fool. He had anticipated the Loyalist forces' chosen dropsite, and his forces had been ready. The traitors would spring their trap, and the Battle of Isstvan V would become a bloodbath of unimaginable scale. At this point, the battle for Isstvan V was nothing short of apocalyptic, and it would become a slaughterhouse of an unprecedented scale, as once brotherly forces turned against each other in a maelstrom of rage, betrayal, and bloodshed, leaving the battlefield littered with the wreckage of fallen warriors and broken machines. The cries of dying echoed throughout the air, underscored by the deafening steps of massive Titan war engines of the machine god. The colossal machines, their purpose was to enact death upon an industrial scale, trampled across the planet's surface, leaving naught but devastation in their wake. The blood of both loyal and treacherous traitors mingled, staining the earth beneath them, as the fight would rage on. Amongst the chaos, the shadowy adepts of the Dark Mechanicum unleashed horrific perversions of lost technology, using weapons and devices pilfered from the ancient Artrelian technocracy. They would unleash unspeakable monstrosities upon the Loyalist forces. These twisted technologies and technological monstrosities tore through the ranks of the Emperor's Astartes, furthering the carnage across the Urgal Depression, which had become all but the focal point of death for hundreds of warriors who perished each and every passing moment, as the specter of an inevitable death loomed large above these warring factions, casting a heavy pall upon every combatant. Though traitor forces initially held firm, their line began to buckle beneath the relentless pursuit and pressure of the Loyalist assault. To them, it was clear that the smallest shift in fortune could turn the tide decisively in the favor of the Emperor's forces, but fate had more in store for them than just that. As a new wave of attackers descended upon the battlefield, the reserve forces, initially expected to bolster the Loyalists' ranks, arrived with their own devastating surprise. The second wave of Astartes descended upon the northern landing zone of the Urgal Depression. Hundreds of Stormbirds and Thunderhawks roared throughout the skies, their armored hulls gleaming under the planet's dusky skies. These new forces, however, were not Loyalists, as they had originally been assumed to be. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Wordbearers, and the Alpha Legion, all once some of the greatest champions of the Emperor, had already pledged their loyalty to Horus and Chaos in secret, and they would represent a force larger than the one that had initially begun the assault on Isstvan V. Their strength untested, yet their weapons were ready for the fray. Fresh and unbloodied, these traitor legions arrived with a resolve forged in secret treachery. Meanwhile, the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders apparently secured the dropsite for the traitors, unknowingly. The ferocity of Ferrus Manus, still seething with rage at his earlier betrayal, led him to abandon the council of his fellow commanders, Corvus, Corax, and Vulcan, his mind set on one goal: to confront Fulgrim in personal hand-to-hand combat. Therefore, Ferrus hurled himself towards the retreating traitor forces, hoping to bring his once close brother to justice. His veteran forces, comprised of the Iron Hands elite Terminators and Dreadnoughts, followed him into the battle, their ranks swarming behind their furious Primarch. What had begun as a concentrated and coordinated assault on the traitor forces quickly escalated into one of the largest engagements ever seen in the history of the Great Crusade. With the arrival of the secret traitor legions, the number of combatants on the field swelled massively, pushing the total count of Astartes warriors involved in the conflict well over 60,000, leading the battlefield to become a maelstrom of blood, metal, and fire, as brother fought brother in a cataclysmic clash. For all the wrong reasons, the Battle of Isstvan V would become one of the most remembered in Imperial history, as one of the most unbelievably tragic and epic confrontations ever fought. As the battle raged on top of the desolate Urgal Depression, Fulgrim watched his brother Ferrus Manus wrathfully push deeper and deeper into the heart of the traitor, deeper and deeper still into the heart of the traitor defenses. In the midst of this chaos, backlit by the strobing lights of artillery fire and the flaring explosions of war, Ferrus was truly a sight to behold, his figure a symbol of both vengeance and rage. The reflection of slaughter danced in his silver eyes and hands, a cold brilliance that mirrored the firestorm around him. For a fleeting moment, Fulgrim wondered if Ferrus would pause, if his brother might turn and join the forces of the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, leading to his survival. But he quickly dismissed the thought, as Ferrus was consumed by an aggrieved sense of honor, his fury too great to be restrained. Fulgrim watched as the last of his Phoenix Guard stood poised, golden halberds held low, waiting to face the brunt of the Iron Hands' charge. Ferrus Manus and his elite Morlock Terminators tore through the remnants of the traitor's defenses. The black plates of Ferrus's armor were stained with the blood of his enemies. His figure and that of his Terminators was unstoppable in their advance. The Phoenix Guard steeled themselves for the clash, bracing for impact. They knew the danger the Morlocks represented, one of the most advanced variants of Terminator armor available, a massive, nigh unstoppable warrior encased in near impenetrable armor. As the two sides clashed, a struggle for power and rage ensued. The scream of lightning claws echoed across the battlefield, sparking in the air as they met the golden blades of the Phoenix Guard's halberds. Electric fire burst forth from the weapons of both sides, lighting up the darkness of the Urgal Depression in a brilliant and deadly storm. It was a battle of sheer fury and wrath, turning brothers into enemies, as Ferrus stormed through the chaos in order to face Fulgrim. Fulgrim stood above the melee, untouched by the violence surrounding him, his eyes remaining fixed on his brother, who in the midst of the carnage strode forward with a singular focus. Ferrus had long yearned for this moment of reckoning. Ever since Fulgrim had betrayed the Emperor and joined Horus's cause, the rivalry between the two had grown deep and too bitter for any form of reconciliation. The possibility of this being their final confrontation was all but secured. and it would end with the death of one of them, as only one would walk away from this battlefield alive. The battle that would become known as the Dropsite Massacre of Isstvan V was one of the most catastrophic events for the Loyalists throughout the entirety of the Horus Heresy, in particular for the Iron Hands, who had been fueled by an overwhelming sense of anger and betrayal, not just of Fulgrim, but of their brethren in the Emperor's children. As the traitor legions planned to usurp the Emperor, Ferrus Manus and his sons, fueled by vengeance, urged the Raven Guard, led by Corvus Corax, and the Salamanders, commanded by their Primarch, Vulcan, to move forward and continue to strike the traitors before any reinforcements could arrive. However, this tactic came from emotion, not logic, and the two Primarchs held their forces back to reinforce their positions, fearing that Ferrus had lost his head to anger. At the heart of the Loyalists' remaining assault were the elite Morlock Terminators of Ferrus Manus, now separated from the other two Loyalist legions. The 10th Legion's veterans formed a central spearhead for the Loyalist charge, as foolhardy as that was. In the midst of this bloody engagement, it seems the two Loyalist legions who decided to move to defensive positions were right, as it was no longer a simple war of attacker and defender, as the remaining forces who had sided with Chaos had arrived on the battlefield, began slaughtering and began to pick off the fractured Loyalist forces. The actions of Ferrus Manus and his Iron Hands, while successful in slaying large amounts of traitors, led to the complete fracture of the Loyalist lines. The moment of reckoning had come. Ferrus Manus, his eyes blazing with fury and conviction, taunted Fulgrim for his betrayal, and condemned his brother for siding with Horus, the self-proclaimed War Master of Chaos, and for turning against the Emperor and his brothers. In Ferrus's mind, the War Master's cause was doomed to failure. Horus had been defeated, his forces broken, and the arrival of 4 more Loyalist legions would surely crush any hopes of his rebellion. Ferrus, believing himself to be the voice of reason, viewed Fulgrim as delusional, his judgment clouded by pride and ambition. But Fulgrim had a different truth to reveal. With a cold smile, he shook his head, savoring the moment of his final betrayal. He reminded Fulgrim that it was not Horus, but Ferrus himself who had misjudged the situation. The battle was already lost for the Loyalists. He claimed that the inevitable consequences would soon become clear. To make his point, Fulgrim gestured towards the northern ridge of the Urgal depression. It was then that Ferrus's eyes widened in disbelief, as he saw the scale of the traitor's strength. What had begun as a desperate assault by the Loyalists was now overshadowed by the overwhelming number of newly arrived traitor legions. The landing zone, to be the site for further Loyalist reinforcements, had become a staging ground for a devastating counterattack. Ferrus realized too late that it was not Horus who had been foolish, but he and his brothers who had walked into a trap they could never hope to escape. Meanwhile, the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, led by their Primarchs respectively, had fought their way back towards the drop site. With their forces battered and bloodied, they sought to regroup, hoping to join the reinforcements of the second wave of Loyalists. Yet despite their calls for aid, no response came. The Astartes positioned on the northern ridge had gone silent. The lines of communication cut as the exhausted warriors of the Raven Guard and the Salamanders approached, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Without warning, the true nature of Horus's treachery was revealed. A flare shot into the sky from the Black Fortress where Horus had made his command bunker. It exploded in a hellish reddish glow, signaling the official reveal of their devastating betrayal. And suddenly, thousands of bolters opened fire, unleashing a maelstrom of death upon the unsuspecting Loyalists. The second wave of Astartes, the Night Lords, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion had just then revealed their true loyalties, as they turned their weapons upon the Salamanders and the Raven Guard, and whatever contingent of Iron Hands were left, guarding the drop site. Hundreds of Loyalist warriors fell under the hail of bolter fire and missile barrages. The battlefield turned into a new slaughterhouse, this time for the Loyalists. As the Loyalist forces were torn apart, Ferrus Manus' Iron Hands, already embroiled with a battle against the traitors, found themselves utterly and completely surrounded. The retreating forces of Horus turned their guns upon them, and the combined might of the World Eaters, Sons of Horus, and Death Guard descended upon the veterans of the 10th Company. Though the Iron Hands fought valiantly with endless courage, they were hopelessly outnumbered, and the resistance would quickly crumble under the weight of the enemy's overwhelming forces. In the midst of this carnage, Ferrus Manus turned to face Fulgrim, his teeth bared in a snarl of fury. The two Primarchs locked eyes with each other. Their hatred for one another so thick in the air that you could cut it with a knife. What had once been one of the strongest bonds of brotherly love had dissolved into an abyss of betrayal and rage. With a roar, the two warriors lunged at each other, their weapons, the legendary Fireblade and Forgebreaker, meeting in a blazing explosion of energy. Their weapons, once forged in the days of unity, now clashed as a violent testament to their enmity. Ferrus wielded the fiery blade with a deadly precision, each strike aimed with the power of 1,000 storms. But Fulgrim, ever the consummate tactician, met each blow with the ebony haft of the massive hammer. Forgebreaker deflected Ferrus' strikes with brutal efficiency. The combat was a symphony of destruction as their monstrous weapons collided in arcs of molten energy, sending shockwaves throughout the battlefield, accidentally slaying countless Astartes near the pair. Their armor, once gleaming in the light of the Emperor's glory, now bore the scars of their endless fury. Dents, scorch marks, cracks, all marked the once pristine surfaces, the unmistakable evidence of a battle between brothers who could no longer see past their hatred for each other, was clear for all to see. In the final confrontation between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, it was not just a battle of strength and skill. It was a collision of ideals, a tragic end to a once nigh unbreakable bond. As the two Primarchs fought, the fate of the Iron Hands was sealed through the escalating and unforgiving clash. Ferrus Manus, his body bloodied and battered, struggled to rise to his feet, the iron will within unbroken despite the toll that combat had taken out of him. With a final desperate cry, he lunged at Fulgrim, raising his flaming blade to strike at his brother's neck. But Fulgrim, drawing upon the power of an accursed sword he had taken from the temple of the lair, met this blow with an unnatural force. He was stronger than he had previously been. The demonically possessed blade rang out, blocking Ferrus' strike with its own deafening clash. The dark power now coursing through Fulgrim caused his body to visibly surge with energy, granting him a diabolical boost in strength, removing what advantage Ferrus had. He pushed against Ferrus with a brutal force, feeling the surprise and growing desperation in his brother's resistance led to Fulgrim to lunge and surge towards his feet, his silver blade flashing, cutting through the air, and with a swift, cruel strike, the blade found its mark, sinking deep into Ferrus Manus' breastplate. The Primarch of the Iron Hands then staggered, a ragged gasp of pain causing him to crumple to his knees, the legendary Fireblade slipping from his hand as agony overtook him. Now Fulgrim, or the thing that was in Fulgrim's flesh, stood over his brother, the silver sword raised to deliver the final blow. Yet in a fleeting moment, a sliver of doubt took root in his heart. As he prepared to strike, he was confronted by the monstrous reality of his actions. The betrayal, the descent to darkness, and the weapon that had corrupted him all came rushing to his mind as he understood with devastating clarity the magnitude of his mistake upon taking the blade from the Temple of Lair. The grip on his sword would then tighten, but the weight of his conscience weighed heavily upon his limbs. He could no longer find the strength to end his brother's life, not in this moment of revelation, but it was far too late to turn back now. The demon's influence over Fulgrim's body was at this point an absolute. Though his mind screamed for him to stop, the blade seemed to move on his own accord, as though it was guided by some malevolent force. Fulgrim's arm swung down, and the sword cleaved through Ferrus Manus' body, severing his head from his shoulders. In that instant, Ferrus Manus, one of the Emperor's most loyal and ardent sons, was no more. In a blinding flash of light, his soul left him, leaving the legacy of the Iron Hands forever altered, their Primarch slain at the hands of his own brother. The 10th Legion, which had once fought with nigh unending strength, was shattered in both body and spirit. A small group of Iron Hands warriors managed to escape the carnage, evading the closing trap of the traitor legions, fleeing with what they could, but their defeat at the dropsite massacre left an unhealable scar on the legion, one that would never allow them to rise to their former glory. The death of Ferrus Manus, however, would not be accepted, as the Primarch's head was not recovered, so there were some delusional enough to believe they could revive the Primarch through a mechanical conflagration of disgusting proportions, turning his corpse into a mere puppet. In the wake of Ferrus Manus' death, the Iron Hands were largely left adrift, their hearts heavy with despair, but their sorrow would deepen further still upon hearing the news that the Emperor, the father and sovereign of mankind, had fallen in battle at the hands of a corrupted Horus much later during the heresy. The realization that both their Primarch and the Emperor had been lost had left their devotion unshaken but changed. Now their anger was unquenchable, and their eyes set to the horizon for the barest hint of a traitor that they may slay. And so came the end of the Iron Hand's major role in the Horus Heresy. The fate of Ferrus Manus, much like his death, is steeped in many myths and rumors, along with conflicting accounts. While some stories suggest that Fulgrim presented his severed head to Horus Lupercal as a grim trophy of victory, others posit a more insidious fate. Some claim that the agents of the Dark Mechanicum, seeking to use Ferrus' genetic material to forge a new twisted legion of Astartes, stole his remains. Alternatively, there are those who believe that his body was, at least in part, recovered by his sons, the Iron Hands, and that certain members of his legion still search for his remains to this very day. And in some of these tales, Ferrus Manus is not truly dead, but rather hidden away, waiting for the moment of his return. However, despite the myths, the Iron Hands themselves had steadfastly refused to accept their own Primarch's death. Their belief that Ferrus Manus somehow survived the atrocities of Isstvan V has provided them with some measure of solace, albeit one that many of them would admit is rather delusional. This hope of his return, however, would do little to heal the wound inflicted upon the Legion. Their ranks had been shattered, their pride deeply wounded, and the loss of their Primarch left them feeling rather hollow. The Iron Hands themselves would return to their homeworld of Medusa, consumed by bitterness, anger, and grief. In the wake of their defeat, the Iron Hands' resentment did not once diminish, as no one would be spared from the icy glare of their fury, not the traitors, not the Xenos, and in some instances, not even their former allies. A particular scorn was reserved for the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, who, in the Iron Hands' view, had failed to follow Ferrus Manus into the fray and were the primary reason that he had died. They believed that if they had fought on, the traitors would have been defeated, despite the numerical advantage that the traitors had at the end of the day. But the resentment did not end with their comrades. The Iron Hands would also turn said hatred inward. Filled with a self-loathing that bordered on lunacy, they would blame their defeat on Isstvan, not only to the traitors, but to themselves, and in particular onto their veterans, who had failed to overcome the challenges of battle, and even on Ferrus Manus himself, despite his shortcomings. They saw the tactical decisions he made as clouded by emotion, rather than being led by cold logic, said logic which had once defined them. His impulsiveness, they believed, had doomed them all, and his flawed judgment had ultimately led not only to their loss in battle, but to the eventual losses of their Primarch, along with the Emperor and Sanguinius. Three great losses that they would see themselves at least partly responsible for. Even more painful was the realization that their legion, while highly disciplined, lacked the psychological and physical fortitude required to overcome such nigh unwinnable odds. In the years that followed, the Iron Hands would embark on a ruthless and relentless campaign of self-improvement driven by an obsessive need to erase the perceived weaknesses that had contributed to their downfall. Their failures at Isstvan V became the catalyst for this transformation, as they sought to eliminate the very humanity that had once defined them. The Iron Hands would begin to coldly embrace the process of mechanical augmentation by replacing flesh with steel, muscle with machine, as cybernetics would become a symbol of their legion and a manifestation of their rejection of their former selves. Through this relentless pursuit of physical and psychological perfection, they aimed to ensure that no weakness, no emotion, and no flaw would ever again stain their honor or stand in the way of their vengeance. Now, in the direct aftermath of the catastrophic dropsite massacre on Isstvan V, a small fleet of loyalist Astartes, consisting primarily of survivors of the shattered Iron Hands and Raven Guard legions, managed to escape the planet's doomed surface. Amongst the vessels they were able to procure was the Sisyphum, a strike cruiser commanded by the mortally wounded Iron Hands captain Uruk Branthan. Despite their grievous losses, these survivors remained determined to continue to fight against the traitor legions, vowing to strike wherever they could. While in flight, the crew of the Isstvan intercepted encrypted communications revealing a disturbing truth. The traitor Primarchs Fulgrim and Perturabo were leading their legions into the warp rift that would come to be known as the Eye of Terror. Their mission was to obtain an unknown Aeldari weapon referred to as the Angel's Exterminatus, which could decisively tilt the scales of the Horus Heresy in the favor of the traitors, even more so than they currently were. The Iron Hands, alongside the other loyalist survivors of the dropsite massacre, swiftly assembled a fleet of their own in order to pursue the traitors into the Eye of Terror. Once within the dangerous, chaotic region, the two Primarchs, Fulgrim and Perturabo, led their combined forces onto the Aeldari crone world of Lydris. There, in the ancient citadel known as Amon Nyai Shak Kills, they believed the Angel Exterminatus lay hidden. However, the quest for the weapon would prove to be nothing more than a ruse by Fulgrim, as unbeknownst to Perturabo and the Iron Warriors, Fulgrim had orchestrated their entire mission to the service of his own dark ambitions. Now, as a champion of Slaanesh, the chaos god of access and pleasure, Fulgrim sought to ascend to demonhood and become a demon prince, nay, a demon primarch. To do so, he needed not only the power of an Aeldari crone world, but the life force of another primarch. This was the true purpose of the Angel Exterminatus, to provide the necessary power Fulgrim needed for living apotheosis. In his deceit, Fulgrim had given Perturabo a cloak bearing a skull-shaped pin that contained a relic known as a Magatar stone. As long as Perturabo remained within the citadel, and with the stone near his personhood, it would slowly drain his life force, feeding it directly to Fulgrim. Yet it would not be until Perturabo discovered this treachery that the Iron Warriors would turn against their supposed allies. What followed would be a brutal three-way melee as the Iron Hands, under the command of Captain Barathan, entered the fray between the two traitor legions. Unaware of the true nature of the conflict and the possibility of slaying 1 to 2 traitor Primarchs. In the ensuing chaos, Perturabo, enraged by Fulgrim's betrayal, seemingly slew the Primarch of the Emperor's Children with the mighty Warhammer Forgebreaker, a weapon that had originally been forged by Fulgrim himself for Ferrus Manus. However, this act of vengeance proved to be all within Fulgrim's plans. Fulgrim's death was merely the final act in his ritual of ascension. His body, no longer bound to its mortal constraints, would transform into a twisted serpentine form, making his successful rise as the first traitor Primarch to fully become a demon prince. With his transformation complete, Fulgrim would teleport his Emperor's Children away from the collapsing crone world, as the energies that had kept the ancient Aeldari site from collapsing into the Eye of Terror had been drained for Fulgrim's ascension, and Lydris began to crumble, its long-guarded secrets to be lost to the void forevermore. Though the Iron Hands and Perturabo's Iron Warriors would manage to escape, Perturabo would take his fleet deeper into the Eye of Terror, seeking refuge within the depths of the black hole at its center. The battle at Lydris marked a missed opportunity by the remaining shattered legions within the Isstvan to potentially take down a weakened Perturabo at the cost of their own lives, and the situation would become increasingly common as the grip of the dark gods tightened around Horus's followers, as Fulgrim's ascension to demonhood would not be the last of its kind, but merely the first of many. Following this, there would be a series of battles and engagements that the Iron Hands would take part in. Starting in 008 M31, the Iron Hands, led by the infamous Iron Father Atruk Mor of the Morgul clan, launched a brutal and decisive attack on the World Eater's Fife world of Bobt. The World Eaters had long used this planet as both a training ground for the Legion, as well as a vital recruitment hub, sending initiates of their ranks, both to and from the world. However, the Iron Father, driven by his deep and unending hatred, led an allied loyalist strike force into a merciless campaign to sever Bobt's role in supporting the traitors. After a vicious battle, Mor was believed to have entered the subterranean macro vaults beneath the capital city of Tradameka, where he pursued his final objective, utterly scouring the planet of all life. The attack was excruciatingly devastating in scope, as the world's surface was stripped of every trace of life, and the infrastructure of the planet utterly annihilated. The World Eaters, who had heavily relied on this world for their supply of initiates, were left without this vital source of replenishment, weakening their overall positions in the heresy. This was not just a tactical strike, it was a message of vengeance. With the destruction of this world, the Iron Hands were able to deal the traitors' premier assault army a serious blow by destroying their recruitment and logistic chain, leaving the World Eaters reeling. At the same time, in 008 M31, on the Forge world of Unmat in the Ultima Segmentum, a civil war erupted as the Synod Magos, once united under the banner of the Imperium, found themselves fractured by their tenuous loyalties to different factions. One faction supported the Loyalists, while another pledged their allegiance to the traitors. This conflict quickly escalated, drawing the Sons of Horus and the Iron Hand survivors of Isstvan into the fray. The clash between these forces turned Oman Mat into a battlefield of industrial warfare, with towering manufactorum complexes and forges now serving as a backdrop to deadly, unending combat. The battles within the Forge world and its hallowed halls were rather brutal, but the devastation would reach far beyond that battlefield, as Mat had been utterly destroyed in the resulting conflagration of war, with fires that raged on for weeks, consuming the once advanced Forge world and leaving it in a charred, ruined state. Some of its fires are said to still smolder to this day, as a testament to the devastation wrought during the ensuing conflict some 10,000 years ago. For the people of the Imperium, the fall of Owen Mat marked the end of a significant industrial hub, but it also revealed a deepening fracture within the Mechanicum, one that would have far-flung consequences as the heresy progressed. In 010 through 011 M31, the Battle of Talran would occur, and perhaps no battle during the Horus Heresy remains as iconic as this one, and it would become, and remains to this day, one of the largest amassed tank battles in Imperial history, as the Iron Warriors Traitor Legion launched a massive assault on the agri-world of Talran, a rather unassuming planet that had once been rather fertile and a life-sustaining breadbasket for the Imperium. To prepare the ground for their invasion, the Iron Warriors virus-bombed the planet, unleashing the deadly Life-Eater virus. This virulent pathogen quickly turned Talran into a barren wasteland, its once verdant fields reduced to endless deserts, rendering the planet nigh uninhabitable and its population trapped in its underground shelters. As the planet's surface lay wasted, these survivors would emerge, rather determined and incensed, in order to defend their world. The Loyalists, including elements of the Iron Hands and the Imperial Fists, responded in kind, launching a counteroffensive to prevent the traitor forces from taking control of this world. What followed was a conflict unlike any other, fought primarily within the sealed, battle-torn hulls of armored fighting vehicles. Tank divisions from both sides engaged in brutal combat, deploying armored units in numbers never seen before in any single engagement. The battle would go on to rage on for months, without any end, as both sides suffered horrendous casualties. Despite their best efforts, the Iron Warriors would eventually be driven from Talran by the Loyalist forces. In the aftermath, the once vibrant world was left as an echo of its former self, its surface littered with the wreckage of over 1 million destroyed tanks, their rusting hulls scattered across the endless dunes of sand. Talran had become a desolate graveyard. For the Iron Hands and the Imperial Fists, the loss of the world itself represented more than just a military defeat. It was a deep wound that they would never forget. The world, once a symbol of Imperial abundance, had been transformed into a graveyard of tanks and a ruin that would be an insult haunting the two legions for millennia to come. Years later, the people of Talran would learn the horrifying truth behind the Iron Warriors' invasion. The traitors had not merely come to conquer, but to claim the Curses of Alganor, a dark and ancient chaotic artifact that acted as a gateway into the realms of chaos within the warp. This revelation would send shockwaves throughout the Imperium, exposing yet another layer of treachery that had occurred throughout the Horus Heresy, further cementing the deep rift between the Loyalist and traitor forces, even those who had surrendered. The Battle of Talran remains a haunting one indeed, as it was not just a battle for a world, but for the very soul of the Imperium, leaving the defenders with a mere Pyrrhic victory. With the Horus Heresy, a rather climactic chapter in the history of the Imperium concluded. Over the course of 8 harrowing years, the galaxy was left broken and bleeding, as the forces of Horus, the War Master of the Traitor Legions, had launched a devastating assault on Terra. But despite their initial successes during the siege of the Imperial Palace, the traitors would be ultimately defeated and the scouring would begin. Horus had been slain and the Emperor mortally wounded in the final confrontation, leading the God Emperor to be inducted and interred within the Golden Throne. stone, his body now a husk, his mind unreachable. The dream of a united Imperium that the Emperor had envisioned now lay in ruins. The Imperium, though fractured, was not entirely powerless in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. The survivors rallied their strengths, driven by vengeance and a desire to restore what they could of the Emperor's legacy, would lead a counteroffensive. Yet the cost of the heresy had been immense. Great swaths of humanity's star-spanning empire had been ravaged by the war and treachery. The Imperial Palace itself, once a symbol of humanity's grandeur and artistic, along with societal brilliance, had been scorched black by the fires of betrayal. Despite this devastation, the Imperium still had sufficient strength to strike back against its enemies with an unrelenting fury. No forgiveness could be granted towards the traitors, who had forsaken their oaths and defied the Emperor's name. The survivors, who still held to the Emperor's vision, were bound by a singular, nigh obsessive mission: retribution. 014 M31 would be the beginning of something known as the Great Scouring. The Great Scouring was the Imperium's vast and violent counteroffensive against the traitor legions. It began immediately after the failure of the siege of the Imperial Palace. With the death of Horus in the early decades of M31, the Imperium would unleash its wrath. This was not just war, it was a relentless purge. The Imperium sought to drive the forces of chaos out of the heart of human-controlled space, forcing them into the warp and into a permanent refuge within the Eye of Terror. During this period of monumental violence, the Imperium sought to reclaim what had been lost and to punish those who had betrayed it. The Inquisition would be founded and tasked with rooting out corruption within the remnants of the Imperium, exposing those who had fallen prey to heresy. Yet the vastness of the galaxy ensured that many of these betrayals would remain unseen, or would take decades upon decades to root out, allowing their perpetrators to continue their dark deeds in secret. The wars of the Great Scouring, though seemingly a united front, were marked by chaos and infighting amongst the loyalist forces. The Space Marine legions, still reeling from the devastation of the heresy, were not exempt from this turmoil. While many, such as the Dark Angels, Space Wolves, and Ultramarines, would follow their own path of vengeance, their own paths in the pursuit of vengeance, each faction would pursue their own agenda in the wider conflicts. The Iron Hands, so too, were no strangers to the bitter and relentless nature of the Scouring. The Iron Hands, having suffered greatly at the hands of their former brothers during the Horus Heresy, were determined not only to seek retribution, but to expunge the remnants of weakness from their ranks. Their efforts during the Scouring were focused on hunting down traitors, along with engaging in savage warfare against the remnants of the heretic legions, and seeking justice for losses they had endured. The scars of the Horus Heresy remained fresh in their minds. Their quest for vengeance at that time was relentless. In this chaotic, violent period, the borders of the Imperium were constantly shifting, as new betrayals and cries of vengeance emerged daily, and the forces of chaos fought tooth and nail to retain what little grip they had on the galaxy. The Great Scouring was a time of unparalleled carnage and confusion. Its impact on the Imperium and the galaxy as a whole would resonate for millennia to come. Yet despite this overwhelming destruction and loss, the Imperium remained united under one singular goal: expunge every last remnant of the traitors and restore order to the galaxy, avenging the Emperor's fall by hook or by crook. The devastating losses of the Dropsite massacre had left the Iron Hands shattered, their spirits broken by the betrayal of their brothers and the death of their Primarch. In the aftermath, their legion in large part withdrew to their homeworld of Medusa, the weight of their trauma pressing heavily upon them. As the survivors reflected on the carnage that they had endured, a profound despair gripped their ranks. But this sorrow was not the final emotion that would define the Legion. The bitterness of loss would transform into a seething rage, not just towards the traitor legions, but towards the Chaos Space Marines in particular, who had led their brothers astray. This fury would soon become a devastating force in the Iron Hand struggle to inflict greater and greater wounds upon those within leadership of the heresy. The Legion, once a mighty force, now was a shadow of itself. The brutality of the Dropsite massacre had left the scars of death and destruction running far deeper into their flesh than it otherwise would have, affecting the very soul of the Iron Hand. Many within the Legion could not accept the death of Ferrus Manus, clinging to the belief that he could be saved or that his absence was only temporary. In the face of this collective grief, the survivors would reshape their identity during the scouring of the Iron Hands forevermore. A council of Iron Fathers and clan leaders would convene on Medusa, marking the beginning of a new era for the Iron Hands. With the death of Ferrus Manus, the Legion could not afford to remain leaderless. A decision was reached. No single individual would ever be allowed to hold dominion again, in order to prevent such atrocities as those which occurred by following the singular leadership of Ferrus Manus. Instead, the Iron Council would become the governing body, a collective of wise and seasoned leaders tasked with guiding the future of the Iron Hands. And said Iron Council would function as a way to mitigate negative emotions by spreading them throughout a larger body rather than a singular individual. This marked a pivotal shift in their internal restructure, one that was vastly different from that of any of the other future chapters of Space Marines. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperial forces had indeed rallied to avenge the Emperor and purge the traitors from the galaxy. The Iron Hands took a different path. Rather than rushing headlong into a blind vengeance like so many other factions, the Iron Hands did indeed send some forces to wreak vengeance, but in large part they retreated to Medusa to contemplate their new place in the galaxy and to assess their purpose, all the while assuring their actions were not driven by the same emotions that had caused the downfall of their Primarch. Thus, the Iron Hands era known as the Tempering began. This conclave of the Iron Council stretched for solar days and weeks on end, with no rest, the debate raging endlessly. This was now a time of intellectual fervor, as each member of the Iron Council dissected every conceivable theory, philosophy, and course of action. This debate was often punctuated by passionate outbursts, but each instance of unchecked emotion was swiftly met with a stern reprimand. Ferrus Manus had instilled within the Legion an ironclad discipline, deep within every Marine, a sense of focus and control despite the tumultuous occurrences of the heresy. That iron within had not been lost. While the Primarch's own emotions had spiraled out of control in the end of it all, the Iron Hands could not afford the same fate. The Imperium needed them, and so they would meet the Imperium's needs as mechanically as possible. The lessons learned from the catastrophic defeats at the Dropsite Massacre and other battles had led to what the Tempering sought to enforce. As the 86th Medusan Day came to an end, the Council's deliberation would finally be concluded, and the rulings were put into motion. The Iron Fathers had decreed a chilling command. Humanity itself was to blame for the events of the heresy. The rebellion of Horus had garnered such traction because the Imperium, the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the Space Marine legions had failed to rid humanity of its inherent weaknesses. Emotions such as jealousy, fear, greed, wrath, and envy had corroded the very foundations of the Imperium. This festering rot had made it possible for betrayal to take root within the hearts of the very warriors who were designed to ensure the protection of humanity. The trust placed in one another by the Primarchs had been a fatal flaw, one that had allowed the corruption of the traitors to spread unchecked until the heresy. This revelation would become a cornerstone of the Iron Hands' guiding doctrine. The traitors and renegades who had turned against the Imperium could not be allowed to spread their moral decay any further. Thereby, humanity's flaw must be purged, not only from their enemies, but from the very heart of the Imperium. The Iron Hands would then become determined that their mission was not solely vengeance. It would be a campaign of calculated ruthlessness, designed to eradicate all weakness and replace it with cold, unfeeling fortitude, which would forevermore define the Iron Hands. Thus, the Council's decision led the Iron Hands into their campaign of purification. The clan's companies, having been forged into powerful strike forces, would then be dispatched to confront those who were deemed as the greatest threats, be they traitor or still on the side of the Imperium. These actions would be dedicated not by emotion but by pure, unflinching logic, and the unyielding need to cleanse the galaxy of its inherent frailties. And thus was the beginning of the new chapter for the Iron Hands, one of vengeance tempered by discipline, where each action was guided by the cold calculations of reason, and where the Legion's survival, nay, the Imperium's, depended on their relentless pursuit of strength through sacrifice. Unbeknownst to the greater Imperium, the Tempering was not solely a moment of introspection and recognition for the Iron Hands. It was a pivotal juncture in their relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus. With their Primarch lost, and the Legion reeling from the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Iron Hands sought not only to heal, but also a means of strengthening themselves through the mastery of technology. For centuries, the Iron Hands had fought alongside the Adeptus Mechanicus, their bond forged in the crucible of the Great Crusade. and solidified through the brutal conflicts of the heresy. Maintaining the Martian priesthood alongside its legions of titans had been invaluable allies to the Legion, as their shared vision of steel over flesh aligned greatly with the Iron Hands' new ideology. It was the Mechanicus that the Iron Hands saw as a reflection of their own doctrine, a symbol of their unrelenting, unending pursuit of strength through the mastery of the machine. Where other factions might have faltered and given into pride or ambition, the Mechanicus, or at least what remained of it, remained 100% committed to their worship of the Omnissiah. The Iron Hands in turn found that the Mechanicus were a perfect ally, one that would not fall victim to the same emotions of weakness that had doomed the Emperor's children and others to their downfall. This shared understanding of values and cold logic, along with mechanical perfection, made the relationship between the two factions both vital and enduring. It seemed as the only logical choice for the Iron Council to align with the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Iron Hands had long been intertwined with the Martian priesthood at this point already, and through the wake of the devastation wrought by the heresy, the need for closer ties was far more pressing than ever, leading to the decision being made. In exchange for the protection and military might the Iron Hands could offer, the Adeptus Mechanicus would grant the Legion unparalleled access to their technologies and any SCCs that were deemed as being under their dominion. This arrangement would not only enhance the Iron Hands' technological edge, but also elevate their Tech Marines' knowledge far beyond the abilities of their counterparts in other legions or chapters. As the tempering drew to a close, the alliance would become formalized through treaties and pacts. The Voice of Mars, a position representing the Adeptus Mechanicus, would be stationed and established within the Iron Hands hierarchy as an official and permanent role within the Iron Council. This position would not be held by a singular individual, but rather a triad of senior tech adepts, each chosen for their unparalleled expertise in understanding the secrets and techniques granted to humanity by the Omnissiah. This new structure was designed to ensure that Iron Hands could draw upon the vast wealth of knowledge held by the Mechanicus, further embedding the influence of the machine god into the very core of the Iron Hands Legion. This alliance, forged in the fires of war, would prove to be one of the most significant turning points in the histories of the Iron Hands and the Mechanicus, as they rebuilt their legion while striding into an uncertain future. The knowledge and power they would garner from this relationship would prove invaluable. The machine god's blessings bestowed through the Tech Marines and the priesthood of Mars would ensure that the Iron Hands would remain as unyielding and unstoppable as the cold steel of machine that made up much of their bodies now was. The Iron Hands' philosophy of the flesh being weak was now deeply rooted with their unwavering and unending reverence for strength and the profound distrust for weakness, which had shaped their perception of the machine and flesh in ways that diverged greatly from the views held by almost every other Space Marine Legion. While many of their brethren viewed machines as powerful tools, the Iron Hands considered them far more than mere appendages or mechanical implements. To the Legion, the machine was the ultimate inheritor of the flesh, surpassing the limitations of the human body. Their emperor enhanced transhuman forms, though once human, were now living machines, flesh and bone given over to the mechanical, a perfect fusion of organic and synthetic made for war. These bodies, however, were not seen as final, but as works in progress, to be constantly improved upon through cybernetic enhancements. It was the Iron Hands' drive to embody the strength of iron, both in body and spirit, that led them to favor cybernetic replacements over more traditional regenerative or vat-grown methods of limb and organ replacement, which were common amongst other legions. The swiftness and efficiency of cybernetics allowed the legion to quickly return injured legionaries back to the battlefront much quicker than the traditional methods of healing. This focus on rapid recovery and unending marches towards war led to a stark truth. No Iron Hands legionary who had fought in battle for any significant period of time was entirely free of bionic augmentation. In the Iron Hands, cybernetics were not a mark of shame, but of honor, and many of the Legion's most seasoned warriors intentionally sought out to remove their flesh and to augment themselves further, driven by the belief that their flesh was weak and that the machine was far superior. For those amongst the Iron Hands who had proven themselves in the fires of battle, the ultimate honor was not merely to fight as a warrior, but to eventually be interred within a sacred dreadnought, the towering machines of war that would allow them to continue fighting in the Emperor's cause far after their mortal bodies had all but failed them. To become a dreadnought was to transcend the frailty of the human flesh, and to become a living instrument of vengeance, a symbol of the Iron Hand's belief in the supremacy of the machine. However, even Ferrus Manus, the revered Primarch, had previously set limits to the extent to which the flesh could be replaced with steel. While the Iron Hands embraced cybernetics and bionics, Ferrus Manus, driven by his strict adherence to certain boundaries, forbade the use of any darker or more esoteric cybermantic technologies, as those they had encountered throughout the Great Crusade. Once he was gone, the Legion uniquely attuned to the forbidden practices and would seize on such discoveries. However, that was only after he was gone. Prior to that, Ferrus Manus would destroy or hide any of the said technologies found under his command. These forbidden sciences and practices of the Dark Age of technology remained shrouded in much secrecy, to the point that the Assagen protocols, the 8 sleepers, and the Sarkozian formulae were all said to be locked away, sealed under the so-called Keys of Hell, a reference to the Medusan goddess of death. The dark secrets were concealed in deep vaults far under the world of Medusa's surface, and in the airless, lifeless moons orbiting the nearly dead star system. Only the most trusted Iron Fathers knew the exact locations of these buried horrors, yet many of them, despite their danger, were not destroyed, merely sealed away, guarded as forbidden knowledge that was never to see the light of day. Following his death, any shred of resistance within the Iron Hands to further augmentation of the flesh for machine began to falter, far quicker than it should have. Some amongst the Iron Hands came to view Ferrus's reluctance to embrace these darker technologies as a flaw and a fatal weakness that had allowed the traitors to strike down their Primarch. It was once said that the rage Ferrus Manus felt before his death was born of his mortal flesh, which had ultimately failed him. With his death, a shadow began to fall over the Legion, and the purity of Ferrus's vision weakened. Some within the Iron Hands began to question the prohibitions that he had set in place. In the chaos of the post-heresy era, the keys of hell, once sealed away, would be turned by a select few within the Iron Hands, and the path to heretical, forbidden, cybermantic knowledge was opened, leading the Iron Hands into quite frankly uncharted territory. Following the events of the Tempering, the Iron Hands alongside the other legions of the first founding found themselves permanently altered by the second founding. The once mighty legions were now split into smaller, more manageable, and less effective formations referred to as chapters, in strict accordances with the edicts of the Codex Astartes. As the 10th Legion, the Iron Hands' surviving clan companies would be divided, and while some of their gene seed was granted to the newly formed second founding successor chapters, the Iron Hands retained control over the 10 great clans of Medusa, ensuring that their legacy would continue, albeit in a starkly different form. Each of these newly created chapters received gene seed of their parent legion, but over time, as the Adeptus Mechanicus isolated and adapted the genetic lines, the Iron Hands successors would slowly evolve into separate and distinct entities. The designation of successor chapter was a rather unique one to those of the first founding. Later chapters created in subsequent foundings were not given this title. They would simply join the ranks of the 1,000 known as established chapters of the Imperium, an ever-expanding force to safeguard the galaxy. As a result, the term successor carries a special weight, as it is a direct lineage to the original legions that served the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Through the ages, the Iron Hands have proved instrumental in safeguarding the Imperium's far-reaching interests. Their actions, though often seen as ruthless and heartless, were recognized by many as unflinching in their fulfillment to the duty of the chapter, without the emotional baggage which would have weighed down other forces. This was especially true during the dark days of the 34th Millennium, when the galaxy was plagued by the malignant spread of the Pale Wasting, a disease that threatened to unravel the entire star system, be it human, orc, Eldar, or any other species within the Milky Way. The Iron Hands, never one to shy away from a challenge, were called upon to enforce a strict quarantine of the forge world of Grammaticus Beta, a vital hub of technological production for the Imperium. Clan Rukan, along with the other clan companies such as Kagrul and Hamak, were dispatched to assist in maintaining this blockade for months on end. Their strike cruisers would remain suspended in the void, silent and ready for action as they monitored the space around Grammaticus Beta. Their task was rather simple yet brutal: to prevent anyone within the world from fleeing the Pale Wasting and potentially jeopardizing jeopardizing the Forge World or its precious resources. In the vast, desolate reaches of space, the Iron Hands would go on to launch deadly boarding actions against any who dared violate the cordon. Orc raiders, Eldar pirates, and a myriad of other Xenos were the first to fall victim to the Iron Hands' cold mechanical efficiency. They would be driven from their vessels one deck at a time, their crews slain with ruthless bolter fire and precise blade work. The aftermath of each engagement was horrific. Bodies piled high and burned in order to prevent the further spread of the pale wasting. The wrecked ships scattered and sent hurling towards the heart of a distant star, ensuring that they could never threaten the Imperium or the wider galaxy again. But the brutality would not end there. With the hostile invaders, the 26th Yermethi Regiment of the Astra Militarum, caught in the orbit of Grammaticus Beta, were trying to flee the pale wasting, and as it could only be assumed that those within the ship may have been contaminated, it meant that they would also meet their end at the Iron Hands' swift but brutal assault. Confusion had led the Yermethi to misinterpret their orders, sending them into the quarantine zone. When they tried to contact the Iron Hands, their calls went unanswered, as they attempted to reorient their ships in the warp, and it was then that the Iron Hands would act. Their fire patterns so efficient that thousands of Yermethi soldiers would perish before they even realized they were under a full attack. The few survivors that were left with nothing but the chilling certainty of their fate. Their ships crippled and left helpless for the Iron Hands' boarding actions. The Iron Hands would show no mercy. Their doctrine was clear. Those who failed in their duties and who strayed from their post were to be punished without hesitation. The Yermethi's desperate cries for help would go unanswered, as they had violated the quarantine and potentially endangered the rest of the Imperium. In their cold logic, the Iron Hands saw no place for weakness and no room for hesitation. To falter, to stray from their path of duty, was an unforgivable sin. The Iron Hands had fulfilled their duty in the most unflinching manner possible, and their actions, though brutal, were deemed as necessary, as was the iron will of the 10th Legion that had prevented the spread of the pale wasting within this sector. In the early 35th millennium, there was an immense time of turbulence within the Imperium. Following the Nova Terra Ingenium, the once unified Imperium was fractured into warring factions. Amidst the chaos, the Adeptus Mechanicus, already a complex organization, was once more torn asunder by internal strife. One of the most pivotal, decisive conflict would emerge, which was called the Morai Schism, a doctrinal and theological rift within the Mechanicus that would reshape the galaxy. At the heart of the schism were the writings of a triad of tech mystics from the remote forge world of Morai. These mystics claimed to have uncovered a hidden, secret pattern in the fluctuations of the Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon, and through their advanced calculations they believed that these patterns had contained the divine word of the Omnissiah and the Emperor, offering a prophecy that would guide humanity's destiny according to its teachings. These revelations pointed to the eventual overthrow of the priesthood of Marge and the merging of the cult Mechanicus with the ecclesiarchy into a singular ecclesiarchical body that would govern the Imperium. Naturally, such radical doctrines were viewed as heretical by the Martian Orthodoxy, the ruling faction of the Mechanicus. This conflict between the two factions quickly escalated into a civil war, with skirmishes breaking out between the Loyalists and the Radicals. Despite the eventual annihilation of the Morai itself, obliterated by Mars's reclamation fleet, the heretical teachings spread quickly, gaining quite the following across the Mechanicus and beyond, including several regiments of the Tech Guard and the Titan Legions. This schism's influence would eventually reach the Adeptus Astartes, leading to chapters that were closely allied with the Mechanicus, most notably the Iron Hands becoming embroiled in this conflict. The Iron Hands, already deeply entwined with the Mechanicus, were especially affected by the schism. Clan Rukan, under the leadership of Iron Chaplain Fronros and Iron Captain Hekon, stood soundly and resolutely, all the while remaining loyal to the chapter's core beliefs. They were amongst the few of the Iron Hands clan companies that remained untouched by the schism, resisting the heretical influences, even engaging in battle against the rebellious Adeptus Mechanicus forces on the Forge World. This engagement saw the use of Vindicators and Predators to rout Cataphracti forces loyal to the radical doctrines. However, Clan Bargos, a faction within the Iron Hands, did not resist the heresy as strongly, ultimately supporting the Morai rebels, leading to a betrayal and the rift between Clan Borgus and the other clan companies, a divide that would continue to shape the Iron Hands. Amidst these tensions, a faction of the Iron Hands, led by Iron Father Setol Solex, embraced the radical doctrines. This was now the beginning of what could become a civil war that would threaten to destroy the Iron Hands from within. To prevent such a disastrous outcome, the Iron Hands' ruling body, the Iron Council, would intervene with a solution that would set a peace. The dissenters who had adopted the Morai teachings would be exiled from the chapter's homeworld of Medusa, and a binding agreement was established to ensure that no blood would be spilled between the two factions. This exile marked the birth of the new chapter known as the Sons of Medusa. It is believed that nearly a third of the Iron Hands brethren chose to join the Sons of Medusa, a decision that was not without controversy. Some Space Marine chapters, notably the Red Talons, reportedly hunted down and destroyed many of these defecting brothers, unwilling to tolerate any form of heretical beliefs. However, the Sons of Medusa did not view themselves as traitors. They considered their exile to be temporary and would continue to perform their duties in the name of the Emperor, believing they remained true to the Imperium despite the separation from the Iron Hands proper. Over time, the Sons of Medusa grew in strength, bolstering their numbers and reinforcing their status as an independent force within the Imperium. Despite their exile, they retained their loyalty to the Emperor and maintained many of the traditions of the Iron Hands, even adopting their iconography and their signature war gear, albeit with some notable modifications. They formed a new set of 3 clan companies, continuing to expand and recruit their new members. By the 37th millennium, the Sons of Medusa's activities had attracted the attention of the High Lords of Terra, as the Imperium sought to reassert order in the wake of the Age of Redemption. The exiled Iron Hands were subjected to a thorough examination. Their loyalty to the Emperor and the integrity of their gene seed was scrutinized with extreme diligence. Despite the objections of the Mechanicus and some within the Imperium, who still viewed the Sons of Medusa with great suspicion, the High Lords of Terra issued a special edict in 011 M37. The Sons of Medusa would be officially ratified as a new chapter separate from the Iron Hands, but still under the banner of the Imperium. Their position within the Imperium, now solidified, led the Sons of Medusa to be seen as loyal, though with a tarnished reputation. Their detractors referred to them as the Scavengers or the Carrion Crows, a reference to their habit of appropriating weapons and technologies from fallen enemies or allies, regardless of who they were, particularly those of other Space Marine chapters. This practice became a hallmark of their identity, one that would define them in the eyes of their fellow Astartes. Yet despite this mistrust that surrounded them, the Sons of Medusa emerged as a chapter which earned the grudging respect for their steadfastness in battle, particularly when the odds seemed stacked against them or insurmountable. They proved themselves time and time again as more than capable of holding the line against the enemies of the Imperium, even if their methods would remain controversial, including the supposed use of Necron and Tau technology. Sometime later, during the 37th millennium, the Iron Hands were once more called upon to demonstrate their strength in a response to a series of uprisings across the Imperium, leading to the Iron Council seeking to quell the threat posed by the renegade disciples of the Blind King, and so they would organize a vast strike force, which included Clan Rukan and no fewer than 4 additional clan companies. Their mission was rather simple: put down these rebellious actions and cease the spreading of these malignant, traitorous actions which were spreading like wildfire across the segmentum, and to confront the growing menace of the Blind King's forces. In a series of brutal and bloody engagements, the Iron Hands fought across numerous worlds, quelling uprisings with a degree of precision and brutality that only the Adeptus Astartes could achieve. The most notable of these campaigns was that on Pelos, where the Iron Hands launched an assault against the turncoat titans of Legio Corventia. In a battle that would become the stuff of legends, the Iron Hands formed a nigh impenetrable armored phalanx, driving the traitor titans back and securing the planet. This victory was celebrated as a monumental achievement, a victory that reinforced their reputation as one of the Imperium's premier military forces, despite them getting less adulation than others such as the Ultramarines. Yet beneath the surface of this triumph was a far more complex and troubling reality. The Iron Hands' victory had come at a cost, in particular that of prolonged doctrinal debates within their own ranks. While Clan Rukan and the majority of the Iron Hands remained rather steadfast and loyal to the Emperor, elements within the Iron Council began to question the validity of their own beliefs. Amongst these voices, there were those that suggested the renegade tech priests of the Osculad, led by the deranged Archmagos known as a Blind King, may not be entirely wrong in their radical views. The Osculad believed that humanity was an abomination and an affront to the Omnissiah, and that the Imperium should be remade in their own twisted image. These whispers of heresy threatened to tear the Iron Hands apart. Clan Rukan, and then Iron Father Darmos, was one of the fiercest critics of these views, dismissing them as madness and a betrayal of the Emperor's divine plan. Under his firm leadership, Clan Rukan remained solid in their beliefs, leading the charge against the Blind King's forces time and time again. The victories of this clan during the period are not to be understated, as the campaign was marked by both ferocity and honor, as they would win several notable battles, including the conflagration of Gold and the Bonehouse Massacre. These victories were seen as critical to the overall war effort, bolstering the morale of the Imperium and weakening the grip of the Blind King's forces. However, despite these triumphs, the Iron Hands could not ignore the undercurrents of dissent within the ranks. The Iron Council's inability to fully resolve the doctrinal conflict would have lasting consequences. For less than 200 years, under the leadership of Iron Father Drachmos, Clan Rukan would suffer one of their greatest and most crushing defeats at the hands of the very forces they had once triumphed over. The consequences of this failure would go on to echo throughout the entirety of the chapter, and it was in large part due to the inability to wrangle some of his own forces thanks to the doctrinal uncertainty. In the 39th millennium, the Imperium faced a rather unusual and dangerous threat. In 756 M39, the industrial world of Euanthos found itself under siege by the forces of Orc war boss Big Mech Rukaba. Known for his unusual prowess with force fields, Rukaba launched a daunting and devastating invasion, as his massive asteroid fortress was able to disgorge hordes of orcs onto the planet's surface. The defenders were then overwhelmed in short order, and the mech quickly set about reinforcing their primary industrial complexes, Thanos. His weapon of choice was a giant hemispherical energy shield that enveloped the complex, and was able to be extended and reshaped however he needed it, rendering conventional weapons utterly useless against it. As the year wore on, the Imperial Guard, led by the Brimlock Dragoons, mounted a counteroffensive, but their heavy artillery proved ineffective against the war boss's invention. Even the might of the Brimlock Dragoons could not pierce this shield, as the situation would grow increasingly dire as the war boss turned the industrial output of the planet against the Imperium and to his advantage, converting assembly lines into factories for his creations, customized kilocans, death dreads, and stampas. The Dragoons found themselves utterly outmatched and outgunned. In desperation, the Imperial forces called for reinforcements from the nearby Medusa. Clan Kargul of the Iron Hands responded swiftly. Iron Fathers from the chapter analyzed the data collected from the ongoing battles, in particular focusing on the nature of the shields, as it became apparent that the shields effectively blocked high-velocity objects, such as artillery and fast-moving vehicles, yet it allowed slow-moving individuals to pass through with little resistance. With this knowledge, the Iron Hands devised a devastating strategy. A shield breaker cohort, resilient and deliberate in their movements, would be dispatched, as they made their way under heavy fire across the outskirts of the city, and as anticipated, were able to walk right through the shield without a shred of hindrance. Their slow and calculated movements were able to bypass the Orcs' invention entirely. The Iron Hands, following the cohort's lead, proceeded to push deeper and deeper still into Orc-held territory, their knowledge of the shield's mechanics allowing them to fight their way through the Orcs' defenses quite easily, bringing the battle to the Greenskins en masse. Within a matter of days, the power source of the energy shield was located and destroyed, and the world would be reclaimed by the Imperium. The Orcs driven back into the void, and the tactical brilliance of the Iron Hands, combined with their meticulous analysis of the situation, would be publicized throughout the planet. However, not all campaigns for Clan Rukan were marked by victory. In 921 M40, the Iron Hands found themselves embroiled in a desperate struggle against the forces of Wag Skullsmasher. While defending the Merivian system, Clan Rukan received a distress call from the freighter Endymion, which revealed the presence of the Emperor's children. This message, however, was a ruse, a trick, which allowed an ambush to be orchestrated by the worshippers of the demon Sapphire King. Ironfather Dermos, the leader of the clan, led his warriors in the pursuit of this particular threat. But what was meant to be a rescue mission quickly devolved into a disaster. The Iron Hands tracked the signal to the death world of Scarvus, and they were set upon quickly by the Emperor's children, led by the sinister worshippers of the Sapphire King. The battle that followed was a brutal and overwhelming one, and the ambush decimated the Iron Hands' forces, leaving the warriors of Clan Rukan scattered amidst the bone jungles of the planet. The destruction of their forces on the planet led to a devastating blow to Clan Rukan, and to the Iron Hands as a whole. Though the attack by the Emperor's children was a reminder of the constant dangers the Imperium faced, the ambush would leave the chapter changed and haunted for many years to come, Scavus becoming a cautionary tale for the entirety of the Iron Hands and many of their successors. In the early years of the 41st millennium, the Forge Moon of Kazia, located in the strategically crucial Agrothon system, was plunged into an unnatural eclipse. For an unknown reason, the moon, a once vital hub of industry and technology, was transformed into a nightmarish shadow of its former self. The sky over the world was consumed by a blackened radiance, as the moon itself became known as the Witching Moon, casting an eerie glow over the entirety of the star system. This malignant event triggered a widespread madness that savagely spread across its entire population. The once orderly and industrious populace descended into horrific acts of murder and madness, driven by the warp-fueled phenomena that spread throughout the moon. The dark forces of chaos seemed to have seized control of the world. Led by dread entities of the Trabane and Company of Misery, these forces ruled as tyrannical overseers, ensuring that the world's populace remained under their horrific sway. The warp-infused light of the Witching Moon bred calamity wherever it reached, tainting all it touched, threatening the stability of the entire system. The moon's madness rippled outwards, imperiling not only the world, but also Agrothian Prime, the system's most vital world. The initial Imperial response to this crisis was a swift but ultimately unsuccessful assault. Squads from the Astra Militarum, supported by Battlefleet Ultima and elements of the Inquisition, would be repelled with devastating force. The defenders, empowered by the corrupting influences of the warp, fought with a savagery and ferocity that overwhelmed even the most senior of Imperial forces, with the madness of the Witching Moon being used as a weapon itself, rendering even the most disciplined troops unhinged after some time. The Imperial forces were left in shatters as they were forced to retreat, leaving the situation in dire straits, with the loss of tens of billions of lives seeming imminent. The turning point itself came when the Charnel Guard chapter of the Adeptus Astartes arrived at the 11th hour. Their timely intervention, alongside a sacred contingent from the Adeptus Sororitas Order of the Black Sepulchre, brought much needed spiritual and martial force to bear. Leading the charge, the Adeptus Astartes, followed by the holy relic known as the Book of Tears, which was a revered artifact said to have the power to ward off the maddening influences of the warp, would attack in full force. The sacred presence of the Sisters of Battle provided a stabilizing anchor amidst the chaos. This reinforcement, having arrived, renewed the assault on the moon, one that would become legendary as the Charnel Guard led the charge, with other Astartes chapters, including the Iron Hands and the Stormlords, along with the Angels Profrier, joining the fray later. This battle was fought across a landscape of soaring metal canyons as tank formations and gunships clashed in brutal engagements, while the brutal Zone Mortalis actions were carried out in the chamber halls of the moon's industrial infrastructure. The battle descended into a cataclysmic struggle for survival, where the forces of chaos were able to inflict severe casualties on the Imperials before being driven out and back into the warp. With the retreat of the Chaos forces, the final purge was carried out to ensure that all life on the moon was eradicated. This once thriving moon would then be handed back over to the Adeptus Mechanicus for a lengthy stay, along with the arduous process of tech exorcism and reclamation, which in part would be assisted by the attachments of the Iron Hands. In another part of the galaxy, far from the warp-induced horrors of the Witching Moon, Clan Rukan once again found themselves embroiled in a more conventional, though no less brutal conflict. conflict. In 123 M41, several squads from Clan Rukan, under the leadership of Iron Captain Garber, launched a swift and decisive strike against a band of Dark Eldar slavers who had been preying upon the agri-worlds of the Huradar cluster. The Dark Eldar raids up until then had been taking a heavy toll on the civilian population, and it fell upon the Iron Hands to remedy this situation. The fighting was rather fierce, and in the chaos of battle, several hundred agri-laborers lost their lives permanently. In the aftermath, accusations arose against the Iron Hands, claiming that the deaths of the civilians were not a mere byproduct of battle, but rather a result of the Iron Hands using them to bait and set an ambush for the slavers. Clan Rukan vehemently denied these accusations, asserting that the losses of civilian life were tragic, but were also the most expedient course in an action which would rapidly remedy the deteriorating situation. Despite the controversy, Clan Rukan's strike had been rather successful and the Dark Eldar were defeated, their slaving operations completely destroyed within the sector, and all these vital agri-worlds were saved, though the cost of victory would leave no shortage of enmity between the residents of the agri-world and the Iron Hands. In 187 M41, Clan Rukan once again found themselves embroiled in a brutal campaign, this time on the war-torn world of Dicronus. The planet was a contested stronghold on the edge of Imperial space, which was underseen by the infamous Iron Warriors Legion, led by warsmith Lung Sul. Known for their ruthlessness and mastery of siege warfare, the Iron Warriors captured a significant number of Imperial Guard forces, whom they would hold in sprawling prison facilities. The captured troops were then subjected to intense mental reconditioning, transforming them into fanatical chaos cultists. This was a horrific fate, one that turned the once loyal soldiers into twisted mockeries of their former selves. As Clan Rukan launched its armored spearhead, they would be the first to breach the Iron Warriors' battle lines, confronting the reality of this prison facility. Upon discovering the extent of the mental reconditioning and the threat of further corruption, the Iron Hands, true to their unforgiving doctrine, took rather drastic actions. Faced with the possibility that any lingering survivors could not be trusted as being either loyalists or traitors, and the risk to the Imperium that would pose, they chose to exterminate all within. No distinction was made between the chaos-tainted and the still loyal guardsmen. Men, women, and children who had served the Emperor would be put to the sword all the same. Though the scale of this massacre was undoubtedly brutal and the deaths of potential innocents would weigh heavily on the consciousness of some, the Iron Hands were nonetheless lauded by the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus, who were also assigned to this war zone. To them, the extermination of the facility's inhabitants, regardless of their allegiance, was a necessary action to ensure the continued survival of the Imperium. The cost was a great risk, but a risk of allowing such a place to remain, or potentially chaos-corrupted individuals to spread throughout the Imperium, was deemed as far greater. The Iron Hands' actions were seen as a stark reminder of their uncompromising loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium, no matter the moral ambiguities of their decisions. Several decades later, in 249 M41, the Iron Hands once again found themselves engaged in high-stakes conflicts, this time on the forge world of Columnus, as a massive orc wog had descended upon the planet, threatening to overwhelm the defenders and destroy their vital production facilities, leading the Iron Hands to act. Moving swiftly, they deployed Clan Company Rukan once again, as they would play the pivotal role in repelling these greenskin invaders. The battles were fierce and rather destructive, but in the aftermath, the orc threat was utterly quelled. Questions would begin to arise within the Iron Council, in particular regarding the conduct of Iron Father Christos, who had led Clan Rukan's forces during the engagements. Allegations of questionable behavior and decisions made during the campaign led some to question whether Christos had acted within the proper bounds of the chapter's strict code. The matter would remain a source of tension within the Iron Hands for a long time to come, as questions of her leadership should not be without merit. Later in 272 M41, Clan Rukan once again in the midst of a fierce and precarious war, this time against a warband of Thousand Sons traitor legionaries. The battle itself took place on the relic world of Dorloth II, a planet of great significance to the Adeptus Mechanicus due to its connection to the earliest days of the Mechanicum. Amidst the war-torn cavern ruins of the planet's surface, a strike force from Clan Rukan, alongside forces of Clan Company Grassak and Drovak, made a monumental discovery. Within the depths of the planet's vast underground network of chambers and tunnels, the warriors stumbled upon long-lost forge complexes, which were ancient relics from the dawn of the very Mechanicum itself. The complex itself was hidden for millennia, and it was a treasure trove of arcane technology and knowledge, containing secrets that could change the very nature of warfare for the Imperium. Though the chapter turned over much of what they found to the Martian priesthood for study and reclamation, they retained several powerful relics for their own use. Amongst these were the Mind-Forged Stave, an artifact of immense psychic potential, and the Gorgon's Chain, a mysterious and powerful piece of war gear, whose origins remain a closely guarded secret. The discovery of the God's Forge, as it would later be called, marked a significant moment of victory for Clan Rukan's history, as it served to bolster the chapter's eternal pursuit of knowledge and power, bringing even more fame to this clan. In 460 M41, the Iron Hands chapter was thrust into yet another conflict. Iron Father Christos, having ascended to the position of war leader, marshaled an overwhelming force of over 800 battle brothers, marking it as the single largest deployment of the chapter in centuries. Accompanied by the full presence of the Iron Council, this vast force set its sights on the Kahinda system, specifically its central world, Kahinda Prime. Here, Clan Company Rukan, as always, took the forefront in what would become a nightmarish planetary assault. Unknown to them, they were marching directly into an abominable trap set by an ancient malevolent power. At the heart of the Horus Heresy was a demonic entity known as the Sapphire King, born from the psychic shockwave unleashed by the death of Ferrus Manus on Isstvan V. The Sapphire King was a creature of insidious power and subtle malevolence. Over the centuries, it had fed on the emotional scars of the Iron Hands, drawing strength from their deep unspoken despair. For the Iron Hands, warriors made of suffering and isolation, repressed all the emotions that fed it, viewing them as weakness to be excised. But the Sapphire King understood them better than they understood themselves. It knew that within their ironclad hearts, these battle brothers had a festering, untapped emotion, ready to explode if the right pressure was applied. The demon awaited patiently, watching as the Iron Hands buried their anger and sorrow beneath cold logic and discipline. The Sapphire King recognized their refusal to confront these feelings made them vulnerable, so it would sow the seeds of corruption, planting within each warrior a rancid seed, a latent bomb of repressed passion that could be detonated at any moment. The demon's plan was to ignite that bomb and to watch the Iron Hands collapse to chaos and self-destruction. As the battle on Kahinda Prime raged on, clan companies of Clan Rukan and Throgol pressed forward, unaware the conflict would escalate when Iron Father Christos, who had been unknowingly corrupted by the Sapphire King, led his forces into the heart of the enemy's stronghold. Here, the true nature of the trap was revealed, as Christos and his followers, known to him as the Christosians, were overwhelmed by the powers of chaos. The more they tried to suppress their emotions, the faster they succumbed to them. The battlefield would become a frenzy of bloodshed as howling demons of Slanesh tore through reality, accompanied by the corrupted warriors of the Emperor's Children Legion. Amidst this madness, the Sapphire King emerged as a grotesque, bejeweled figure of unfathomable power. As it strode into the battlefield, it would seem as though the fates of the Iron Hands was sealed. But in the midst of the chaos, one warrior, Cardan Stronos, experienced a revelation. He would understand that the Iron Hands' attempt to sever themselves from their emotions had only made them more susceptible to this particular demon's corruptive influence. Their only chance at salvation led not in suppressing their feelings, but in confronting them and embracing them, thereby forging something greater, shackling their emotions to their iron will, rather than allowing their iron will to suppress them, or their emotions to rip their iron will apart. Unleashed, the Iron Hands now fought with an unending amount of determination. Stranos activated his Vox and issued a bold command. He ordered his battle brothers to release their anger and grief, knowing that only embracing said emotions would set them free from the demon's spell. As the Iron Hands freed their suppressed fury, the Sapphire King's power began to unravel, as the repressed energies that it was feeding on were quickly vented, and with a deafening shriek, the demon's hold on them was ruptured. Now unleashed, the Iron Hands fought with a ferocity that they had long denied themselves. In the cataclysmic surge of rage, they tore through the demonic forces, blasting Slaneshi demons apart with their sheer firepower, and tearing Emperor's children to ruin. No longer shackled by their own fears, the Iron Hands, now immersed in the violence of war, came out on top. The Sapphire King, a once nigh invincible force of corruption, was utterly obliterated by the unleashed fury of the Iron Hands it had so cultivated, as the remaining Emperor's children had their numbers shattered, crushed beneath the unending assault. To ensure that the hordes of the demon engines were eradicated, the Iron Hands launched a massive orbital bombardment scouring the surface of the planet. As the skies above the world burned, due to weapons of unimaginable power raining down upon it, ensuring that the demon's influence was permanently erased from the Imperium. The Iron Hands had faced an internal threat more insidious than any external enemy they had before, though through an act of willpower, they were able to forge themselves into a stronger version of Iron Hands, one which in theory would be even greater than that desired by Ferrus Manus. The aftermath of the Granada campaign had left the Iron Hands severely wounded, not only in numbers but in spirits, though manpower could be replenished and the destruction of vehicles repaired or replaced. The psychological scars from battle, especially the revelation of how close the whole chapter came to falling to chaos corruption, proved far more devastating, as nearly a third of the Iron Council had succumbed to the seductive pull of chaos, their souls lost to the influence of the demon. These corrupted individuals, alongside many of the warriors who followed them, had fallen so deeply that their undoing would have far-reaching consequences if it was ever discovered by the Inquisition. The very foundation of the Iron Hands, which was built upon the uncompromising ideology of strength and logic, was now in question. The Christosians, a faction dedicated to the devotional following of the tenets of the Tempering, had long since represented the chapter's most extreme interpretations of their founding principles, the beliefs of both iron over flesh and logic over emotion, as being the only true path forward. Yet in the wake of this heretical revelation, the Iron Hands were forced to confront the devastating possibility that this unyielding obsession with emotional excision and the perfection of the machine had in itself become a weakness. In their quest to purge all perceived frailty, they had been blind to the inherent danger of denying their own humanity and the weakness it was causing. As such, the Iron Hands would reel from the uncomfortable truth. The Iron Council, once a bastion of unshakable, unquestionable authority, now teetered on the verge of utter collapse. Panic permeated the Council's emergency sessions, as multiple theories and counter-arguments were posited, then swiftly dismissed. How could the chapter continue if the very principles that defined their existence was irrevocably tainted by the very weakness that they had long sought to expunge? In this moment of crisis, it was Cardan Stronos, the warrior who had essentially saved the chapter, who would rise from his seat and command attention. He disconnected himself from the mechanical interfaces of his body and armor and addressed the council in a voice free from the unusual rigidity of his own augmentations. He spoke of the chapter's new insight, casting their trials not as a devastating defeat, but rather as a test and a gift, one derived from the God Emperor's very own creation, themselves. Despite the forces that sought to lead them into darkness, it seems that the Iron Hands had been granted the chance to see the flaw within themselves, and through confronting said flaws, they had triumphed. With a booming declaration, Stronos delivered words that would reshape the Iron Hands in the very future. With steel we are stronger, but without a soul we are nothing. These words would become enshrined across Medusa, carved into iron glass plaques and passed down through generations, as a reminder of the pivotal moment when the chapter faced a potential unmaking. That day, despite the lingering opposition from the remaining Christosians and the voice of Mars, Xantros was unanimously elected as the new war leader of the Iron Hands, a position that would hold, and he would be re-elected to time and time again for the rest of his life. His speech had not immediately undone centuries of indoctrination. One address could not so easily erase a deep-seated conviction that had been brought about through generations. However, it was the beginning of something far greater, a shift in perspective that would unfold over the following centuries, slowly and methodically improving the Iron Hands in ways they hadn't considered before. Under Stronos' leadership, the Iron Hands would evolve, and the number of Iron Fathers, including the elevation of Epistolara, Lydrak, and the Iron Chaplains Shuglar, steadily grew. with many of the chapter's librarians and chaplains rising to prestigious ranks. While the Iron Council continued to operate with cold and calculating logic that had long been their hallmark, they would become much more attuned to the dangers of unchecked obsession and the risks of heresy abandoning humanity could lead to. Crucially, many efforts were made to temper the most inhuman impulses within the chapter, and a more balanced approach would become to take hold. On the battlefield, the Iron Hands would continue to wield the might of steel machine, but this time tempered by the enduring wrath of their Primarch Ferrus Manus. They would not abandon the perfection of the machine, but many battle brothers inspired by Stronos' vision would temper that steel with the fires of their rekindled soul and the strength of their flesh. The legacy of Cardan Stronos had functionally reshaped the Iron Hands as much as that of Ferrus Manus had once done. Later, in 742 and 41, the Imperium launched a large-scale military offensive known as the Damocles Gulf Crusade, aimed at repelling the newly arisen Tau Xenos threat. The conflict itself unfolded in the Lethish sector, a region stretching from the Damocles Gulf to the Purdus Rift anomaly in the eastern fringes of the galaxy. The strategic goal of the crusade was to push back the Tau forces, which had begun to encroach upon several subsectors and eventually force the Tau back to their homeworld, where they would be rightfully purged from existence. This crusade was spearheaded by a formidable vanguard, which included 12 capital ships of the Imperial Navy, 5 crusade companies of various Adeptus Astartes chapters, and a litany of Imperial army forces. The fighting strength was drawn from some of the most renowned and battle-hardened forces the Imperium had to offer: the Ultramarines, the Scythes of the Emperor, the White Scars, and the Iron Hands. These Astartes, supported by 19 regiments of the Imperial Guard, would also include 7 regiments raised specifically by the ecclesiarchy of the world Brimlock. Together they would engage the vile Tau in a series of pitched battles with the goal of driving them from Imperial space. However, the crusade was ultimately a stalemate, as the Imperium was forced to halt their offensive on the Tau-sept world of Dalthur in order to contend with a far greater threat, the encroaching Tyranid Hive Fleet Behemoth. As the Tyranids pressed in from the galactic core, the Tau, perhaps realizing the fluidity of further conflict, extended an olive branch, opting for diplomatic negotiations instead of continuing war. The Tau military allowed the Imperial forces to withdraw without further resistance, thereby ending the first significant military engagement between the Tau and the Imperium. Though the crusade failed to bring its primary objective to fruition, it provided the Imperium with valuable insights and lessons in combating the Tau. These lessons would prove instrumental in subsequent Imperial campaigns on the worlds of Nimbosa and Medusa V, where the Tau would once again find themselves at odds with the Emperor's forces. In 810 M41, the Iron Hands found themselves amongst 9 Astartes chapters tasked with liberating the Kaldar system from the grip of Wag Grazod, led by the savage Orc warlord Grazod. Following the crushing victory against the Orcs, a grand feast was organized by the governor of Kaldar Prime. To honor the heroism and sacrifice of the Adeptus Astartes, every chapter with the exception of the Iron Hands attended this celebration. The refusal of the Iron Hands to participate was not a matter of disrespect, but a deliberate choice to abstain and a statement of disdain. The Iron Hands would not share a table with the Raven Guard, whose actions and philosophy they viewed with great suspicion. This public refusal to dine together with other fellow Astartes was a powerful declaration from the Iron Hands in the belief of their own path. In 812 M41, the Iron Hands' reputation as a merciless fighting force of the Imperium was further solidified during the purge of the Kwal subsector, as the taint of chaos had spread throughout this region thanks to High Governor Kwal, who had succumbed to the seductive power of Slanesh, the god of excess and pleasure. From the governor's court, the corruption had spread like wildfire, seeping into the very fabric of the subsector. Within a matter of weeks, the entire region had been teeming with chaos cultists and heretical forces. Tasked with eradicating said corruption, the Iron Hands responded with a ruthless swiftness and precision that would become their hallmark. Under the command of Lord Commander Asen Roth, the Iron Hands stormed the subsector with a terrifying efficiency, striking before the forces of chaos could organize any meaningful resistance, and quickly moving on to the next target. Their primary target was the hive world of Sardunus, where a vast number of chaos cultists had used forbidden rituals to tear a portal into the warp. From this rift, the demonic monsters of the Neverborn poured forth, threatening to corrupt the material realm permanently. The Iron Hands would fight through these monsters with the relentless relentless fury of a storm, cutting down both heretics and demons alike. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Iron Hands pushed forward with a terrifying discipline, forcing the inhabitants of the subsector to surrender. Many of its citizens, realizing the magnitude of their treachery, begged for mercy, but the Iron Hands, driven by their deep-seated hatred for anything chaos and anything related to the Emperor's children and Slaanesh, showed them none. Their cleansing wrath was absolute. Once the subsector was secured, the Iron Hands enacted a brutal purge, executing 1 in every 3 civilians as punishment for allowing chaos such a foothold. This grim retribution served as both a punishment and a reminder to the survivors that the Iron Hands would not tolerate any such weakness, and any further wavering in their faith would be met with a swift and uncompromising action of cold and calculated retribution. In the aftermath of this purge, the subsector was left in a state of utter devotion to the God Emperor. The populace, now fully aware of the outcome should the Iron Hands be called to cleanse said corruption again. In the year 999 M41, the forces of Abaddon the Despoiler erupted from the Cadian Gate, launching the 13th Black Crusade, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the Imperium. The Iron Hands, given the precarious position of their own homeworld of Medusa, knew the full weight of the threat they now faced. Nestled in the very edge of the Eye of Terror, Medusa was all but guaranteed to be one of the first targets of the incoming traitor legions. As the looming shadow of the invasion grew nearer, the chapter moved swiftly to prepare their defenses. While it is known that 2 of the clan companies were dispatched elsewhere to fortify key regions, the bulk of the chapter's might was focused on defending their ancestral homeworld. The Iron Hands understood that the strategic importance of Medusa was paramount, as they could not yield it to the forces of chaos without a brutal fight. The largest confrontation of this defense came when all 10 of the chapter's gargantuan tract fortresses were mobilized in order to face the Hardani 13th Heavy Armored Regiment, a formidable traitor guardsman garrison. The battle itself unfolded on the plains of Medusa, and it would become one of the more significant armored clashes in recent Imperial history. It was said to rival even that of the infamous Battle of Talaran, fought during the Heresy, where over 10,000 tanks stormed through the desert planet. However, this time it was the Iron Hands who awaited their enemy's advance. As the traitors closed in, the mobile fortresses, which were massive fortified structures capable of devastating power, were prepared to meet them head-on. On the 5th day of battle, the enemy pressed ever closer to the Iron Hands, unleashed a devastatingly blistering first volley, firing with a precision and force equal to that of the Centurio Ordinatus of the Adeptus Mechanicus. In an instant, over 100 enemy tanks were obliterated, their hulks burning on the barren plains of the world. However, the traitors were relentless and unyielding, pressing forward despite their own heavy losses. At the battle's peak, the traitor guardsmen succeeded in breaking through the Iron Hands' lines. An armored company of traitors outflanked the Iron Hands' mobile fortresses, enclosing on them and firing at nearly point-blank range. Eventually, the battle would reach its critical juncture when the Iron Hands, knowing the defense of Medusa hung in the balance, launched a desperate counteroffensive. Assault squads, blistering with melta-bombs, launched themselves from the towers of their mobile fortresses, landing on top of enemy tanks before jumping and moving on to the next one. Many of the Astartes were cut down as they descended, their bodies torn apart by the furious pineal-mounted weapons or crushed beneath the heavy treads of the heretical vehicles. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain, as this relentless charge disabled or destroyed the majority of the traitors' armored squadrons, including their tanks, sending their forces into a chaotic retreat. But the battle was far from over. The Iron Hands, rallying with a fury of warriors driven by the defense of their own homeworld, unleashed a massed armored assault of their own. From their fortress, waves of Predator Annihilator tanks surged forward, their weapons unleashing a torrent of las cannon fire. The tanks of the remaining traitors were quickly overwhelmed by the weight of the Iron Hands' counterattack, their hulls torn apart by the deadly beams. By the end of the campaign, the Iron Hands had fully secured Medusa. The once looming threat had been all but eradicated permanently, but the cost was significant and the carnage rather deep. However, the chapter was not only able to protect their home, but also mobilized additional clan companies to bolster the defense of the Cadian system as a whole. By the end of the campaign, the Iron Hands would secure Medusa fully. The Iron Hands' victory allowed them to further strengthen the Imperial defense efforts, with a naval task force dispatched, in particular, to reinforce the naval world of Vigilatum. At an unknown date in M42, the Imperial forces retreating from the Stygius sector during an invasion were met with the Iron Hands standing firm, while other Imperial forces chose to fall back at the face of the overwhelming chaos. The Iron Hands refused to abandon their post. Their conviction carried them them to the beleaguered world of Mordian, which was currently under siege by Chaos forces. Here, alongside a mere remaining handful of Mordian Iron Guard regiments, the Iron Hands sought to purge the weakness that they had been shown earlier in the campaign, striving to reforge the populace and to reaffirm the unyielding devotion to the Emperor that every Imperial citizen should have. The siege of Mordian would become a crucible in which the Iron Hands would further test their resolve. In what would become known as the Iron Crusade, the chapter was joined by several allies, all united by their desire to extract revenge on the Chaos forces. Amongst these allies were the Brazen Claws, the Fire Lords, the Silver Skulls, the Sons of Medusa, and the Iron Lords. Each of these chapters, enraged by the perceived defeatism amongst the Imperial forces, converged on Mordian in order to turn the tide in the favor of the Imperium. Upon their arrival, the Iron Hands found a planet ravaged by the presence of the Night Lord's warband, led by the infamous Ahakar Deathshriek and his legion of raptor hordes. Deathshriek had terrorized the planet incessantly, instilling fear in the Mordian population in order to fuel a chaos ritual he had prepared that would transport the entire world deep within the warp, a fate that could have doomed the entire world of Mordian permanently and all of its inhabitants. The Iron Hands and their allies struck with a signature bluntness by emerging from the warp without warning, as they engaged the traitor fleet in orbit while simultaneously launching a drop pod assault on the capital city of Mordian. Leading this charge was Captain Kenork Var of Clan Averny, who through brutality drove Deathshriek's forces back. One by one, the other clan companies of the Iron Hands would join the fray, overwhelming the forces of Chaos in single combat. Var wounded Deathshriek, signaling a shift in the battle's momentum. However, the traitors would not be routed so easily, as the Iron Hands' positions faltered from the fresh assault thanks to the Benedictine Guard and the Cult of the Whispered Word. A coalition of renegade warlords realized their opportunity to annihilate the Iron Hands once and for all. Deathshriek, emboldened by this new threat, rallied his forces and led a powerful assault on the Iron Hands warships, outnumbering them 3-1. At this critical moment, reinforcements arrived. Loyalist successor chapters rushed to aid the Iron Hands, disrupting Deathshriek's armada and sending them into utter and complete disarray. The new Loyalist warships turned the tide of battle, at least in space, but the war was far from over. The Iron Hands unleashed their old and reliable, yet devastating, Hammer and the Storm Doctrine. Their orbital bombardment, seemingly indiscriminate, was anything but. The Iron Hands Tech Marines had covertly reinforced several surviving bunkers within the Mordian's capital, erecting void shields to protect key positions while the rest of the battlefield would endure this heavy bombardment. In under an hour, the Chaos forces' grip on Mordian was completely broken for a second time. The Iron Hands delivered a crippling blow to the forces of Chaos. Once the skies had been cleared, Imperial reinforcements from Krypamundi arrived, allowing the Iron Crusade not only to push back the forces of Chaos, but to lead a counterattack on their forces in nearby worlds. With Mordian now secured, the Iron Hands Iron Council set in motion the second phase of this campaign, a mission to cleanse the surrounding worlds of the Mordian system, reclaiming refineries, orbital shipyards, all throughout the Corvus system. However, regardless of what had happened previously, the Iron Hands' overall struggle to defend their homeworld was far from over, as an unprecedented assault from Typhus, the leader of the Death Guard's first plague company, would occur, as he launched a raid on the world of Medusa. Joined by war bands of the Cleaved and the Purge, along with several other Nurglite renegade forces, Typhus and his band of Plague Marines arrived with a singular devastating purpose: reduce Medusa to a toxic, decaying husk. The Iron Hands had already suffered significant damage, forcing their clans to rally again to protect their homeworld. After a fierce conflict, they succeeded in repelling the attackers, driving them back. However, the damage inflicted upon Medusa was catastrophic. Regions of the planet were left essentially permanently cursed and designated as quarantine zones, their environments irrevocably scarred, and the disease of corruption brought by Typhus's forces left there in perpetuity. However, the galaxy grows ever darker, and even the Iron Hands, known for their unwavering resolve, find themselves constantly caught in the escalating storm of challenges. The Iron Council, once a pillar of stability and wisdom, now faces internal strife once again. and the unsettling reality of allies falling prey to mindlessness and corruption has left them ill at ease, as they cannot help but reflect on the past, haunted by the long-forgotten decisions and the bitter losses they led to. As vast swaths of the Imperium are consumed by chaos and turmoil, they are left wondering what the future holds for their chapter. In particular, the Council itself has noted changes in its own ranks, transformations brought by the leadership of Cardan Stronos. Under his guidance, Clan Rukan has flourished, epitomizing a shift in the chapter's once unyielding position. These changes, though momentarily invigorating, also serve as a stark reminder of the darker aspects of their history. It is impossible for the Iron Council not to draw on parallels between Stronos' rise and the tragic fate of their former Primarch, a father lost to his own bitter end. With such reflections weighing heavily on their minds, the Council is left questioning whether the logic of their conundrum has any rationale to it. Amidst these doubts and concerns, the Iron Council has called a great conclave known as the Grand Calculation. This gathering will determine the future of the Iron Hands chapter and their role in coming conflicts. A war unlike any other the galaxy has ever seen is now underway, and the Iron Hands must decide where best to commit their might. Will they scatter their strength, as has often been the case in past campaigns, or will they instead consolidate their forces and strike decisively, pushing against the most pressing to humanity with the full force of their chapter? The members of the Iron Council now must remain stalwart in their beliefs that overwhelming force is the key to victory, but they know that they cannot afford to act without deliberation. The Iron Hands will not entrust their fate to the capriciousness of chance.